Thank you very much, Karen. Um, I now have the honor of introducing our first conversation. I'm going to ask the panelists to come and sit, and I will introduce them as they get settled. Let me just say this before I get started. Every one of these individuals has a long and fascinating background, too extensive to discuss. I recommend that you read those bios in the program, and I'm just going to touch on a few of their current affiliations and a few words about the unique experiences that bring them to this stage, to this conversation. So, furthest to your right, a phrase that is never used with Gara LaMarche, but I will continue, is Gara LaMarche. Gara is well known to many of you, as those laughs will attest, formerly the CEO of Atlantic Philanthropies and Director of U.S. Programs at Open Society Foundations. He is currently the President of the Democracy Alliance, the largest network of donors dedicated to building the progressive movement in America, focusing on electoral campaigns, civic engagement, media, and leadership development. Next to him, well, no, not really, but next to him is Erin Velarde, founder and director of Vote, Run, Lead, a national organization using technology and training to accelerate the number of women in civic and political leadership. She launched VRL when she was vice president of program and communications at the White House Project, establishing the largest national political training program for women for public office and civic life, training over 15,000 women. Next to her is Rashad Robinson. Rashad is the executive director of Color of Change. As a national online force driven by over 1 million members, Color of Change moves decision makers in corporations and government to create a more humane and less hostile world for Black people in America, including forcing over 100 corporations to stop funding the conservative policy organization ALEC, holding local authorities accountable for abuses and anti-Black violence, and centering the voices of Black workers, students, families, farmers, immigrants, and others in the public discussion on justice in America. Next is Tom Basile. Tom is Senior Advisor for Policy and Strategy for Reclaim New York. Reclaim New York's chair, Rebecca Mercer, is well known in philanthropic circles, but Tom, in his own right, is deeply experienced and connected in politics, media, and organizing. He served in the White House under President George W. Bush. He served as the executive director of the New York State Republican Party and was a key player in gaining a Republican majority in the New York State Senate. He was also been a frequent media commentator and advisor to politicians and an outspoken advocate for tax and ethics reform. And our moderator is PNY's own newly elected board member, Leticia Paquero. Leticia, yay, is the executive director of the Andrus Family Fund, which has a focus on young people and particularly organizations that utilize community organizing as a tool to remove barriers and create social change. We are very fortunate to have these extraordinarily knowledgeable leaders open our program. Leticia, thank you for helping get the conversation started.
Thank you. So, Philanthropy New York put me to work right away as a board member, as you can tell. So, buenos dias.
Buenos dias.
Okay. So there's going to be a few call and response moments in our time together. So I just want to get you all started. Buenos dias.
Buenos dias.
Thank you. So I'm really excited to be moderating this conversation, but I'm going to take moderator's privilege for a second. And I'm going to tell a little story. It's actually a true story that hopefully helps situate us in time and place for this conversation. So this week, sadly, I lost a dear friend, unexpected to our friend community. And I want to bring him into this space for just a few moments. I think it's important It's an important way to situate our conversation. He was young by what I would call all New York City standards. I think in New York, we at least like to think that we stay young, hip, and cool, like this panel, much longer than other parts of the country. He was not a native New Yorker, though. He grew up in Gary, Indiana. And for those that don't know Gary outside of being the home of the Jackson Five, it was once a booming city that was home to U.S. Steel. But today, like a lot of the Rust Belt, suffers from deep, deep disconnection, disinvestment, and entrenched segregation. His family made their way to Gary as what we call in lots of the communities that I'm a part of as refugees from the Jim Crow South, the Great Migration. And he moved to New York City to fight for the rights of the communities and the people that he cared for, and to love who he wanted to love. And he and I met over a decade ago, working in an organization fighting for the rights of women and girls. We hit it off right away. We both like to drink wine and to party a little bit. And we were fighting for the rights of women and girls that are oftentimes forgotten, disenfranchised, and historically marginalized. He cared really, really deeply about the communities that he was a part of and that he identified with, and the rights of people like me and like you. He cared about voting. He cared about access and the liberties that he knew many in this country didn't always have and sometimes take for granted. So I bring him into the room today because I want to ask us to situate the conversation about community organizing and voter engagement around regular people like my friend Jerome. We sometimes get stuck when we talk about voter engagement, somehow talking about this like elusive voter, right? Like the voter doesn't really have a face. It's this sort of theoretical conversation. And we forget to ask questions about who is this elusive voter. And when we talk about community organizing, we forget that we're actually talking about a community with individual people. We forget what they sound like, who they are. And I oftentimes ask in my work, working with young people, do we ask communities, where do they hurt? So I think that that's a central question when we're talking about issues like voter engagement. So today, my good people, I'm going to ask you to listen deeply to our esteemed panelists and to situate the conversation in the urgency of this current political moment, no matter what your political affiliation is. And situate the conversation in a place and a time with the face of actual people, so that it isn't a theoretical conversation about nameless voters or communities, but about real people, real issues, faces, and lives. Can we do, this is a call and response moment, by the way. Can we do that, community? Yeah. Okay, thank you. All right, people are awake. They've had their coffee. So we've read the bio, so I had some notes that I was going to do that, but thank you, May. So just, very quickly, one of the key goals of our conversation today is to help lay a baseline and understand what it will take to increase democratic participation for the country as a whole, but especially for the communities and the constituencies that you all work with. So I want us to think about a few things, audience and panelists. Voter engagement and access, what does that mean? Creating and increasing ways to engage and empower communities, especially folks that have been historically out of the process. And for me, something that I think either undergirds it all or undermines it is the access to credible information. So I want to ask the panelists to take us away, tell us, as we think about these three sort of artificial buckets that I've created there, how do we build a more democratic participatory process? And Tom, I'm going to start with you.
Well, sure, and it's a real honor to be here. Really appreciate the invitation because this is a truly national challenge. Here in New York in particular, and you've seen some of the recent polls show that up to 90% of New Yorkers, for instance, feel like we have a significant public corruption problem. And what you see is as people's idea of what government is to them and how it impacts them sort of goes off the rails with folks thinking that we have a significant public corruption problem, we've seen people withdraw from the system. So when we talk about voter participation, it's not just about the issues of, from our standpoint, it's not just the issues of voter access or ballot access, for instance. It's about opening up the system to people and making people think about the system differently. Because in our qualitative and quantitative research, one of the things that we have found is a high level of disconnect, where people just feel, regardless of political persuasion, whatever this apparatus is, whatever that institution is, isn't quite connected to me as a person, what my needs are, what my values are, and what I need for my family or for my business. So there are issues about ballot access that are important, but there's more, I think also more of this global issue that we face, all of us face, about how do we give people a sense that they can be empowered, that one individual can make a difference, that their issue is important. And I think all too often, groups, particularly public policy and issue groups, political organizations, they think of the voters as sort of like monoliths, all right? And what they fail to do is really personalize and engage with the individual, all right? What is important to that individual? And we've taken a lot of time in our organization to say, all right, what's going to motivate somebody? What's going to motivate somebody to actually go to the town board meeting? What's going to motivate somebody to actually want to register or participate in raising their voice about a particular issue? And that goes back to basic marketing principles. It's altogether fitting that we're here on Madison Avenue having this conference, because so much of what we need to do to bring people back to the system, to make sure that we're scoring a place in the audience mind share when it comes to our issues, is a basic marketing practice where you do need to personalize and engage. You do need to make it relevant. And you need to give people a sense that there's going to be an individual benefit, because people do make decisions from the inside out. And that doesn't mean that people don't care about the bigger world, but the fact of the matter is, when we're talking to somebody, we always talk in terms of what it means to their household, what it means for their child or for their family. And I happen to think that that's something that we all can do a little bit better as a way of reaching more people and giving people more faith that they can have an impact on the system.
Thank you, Tom. So I'm going to move on to Rashad, but I'm really curious. In philanthropy, we're all the rage right now with narrative change, and so I'm going to translate your basic marketing practice into philanthro speak. And right, it's about narrative change for us, but I think the concept is the same. So Rashad, tell us a little bit from your perspective and Color of Change perspective. What does it take to build a more transparent, a more participatory democratic process? And I know a lot of the work that Color of Change does is around narrative change. And so I think we didn't plan that, but it worked out really well.
Great. Well, it's great to be with you all. The first thing I want to say is that we have this theory at Color of Change and this concept that people don't experience issues, they experience life. That the forces that hold people back on gender or race or the economy don't just sit in sort of one area over here and not one area over here. Like a racist criminal justice system needs a media climate that supports it, that economic inequality requires political inequality, and so forth and so on. And so the concept and the idea behind how we do our work is about building power. And it's about building power for the most marginalized communities so they can be heard, counted, and visible. Color of Change was founded 11 years ago, or a little over 11 years ago, in the aftermath of a flood, which was Hurricane Katrina, that was caused by bad decision makers, that really turned into an epic disaster by those same bad decision makers. And while Black folks were literally on their roofs begging for the government to do something and were left to die, there were a whole lot of conversations about issues that we know about or know a lot about: geographic segregation, generational poverty, the impacts of climate change, and what we've done to our education system and criminal justice system, and the aftermaths of Katrina, the way that corporate power worked in that city, and voting rights worked in that city. But at the heart of it, no one was nervous about disappointing Black people. The government wasn't nervous, media wasn't nervous, corporations weren't nervous. And when institutions that are in power are not nervous about disappointing your community, it doesn't really matter what great report you have on the side that sort of like illustrates the issue and makes the argument. It doesn't matter sort of like what the lawyers do in the courtroom. It sort of doesn't matter what the people in Silicon Valley do with apps. You're not going to code your way out of this or legal your way out of it or nonprofit executive direct your way out of it. And so we think very clearly about power as a key force in our sort of our movement building. And we have a theory about responding to moments, and we do that through our membership, building power oftentimes through building campaign works, and then finding the systemic pivot that exists. And so whether that was the work we did around ALEC, which was responding to the, voter ID laws advancing around the country, like the Texas law that said you can vote with your gun license but not your student ID, or the proliferation of stand your ground laws in the aftermath of Trayvon Martin. The ability to respond to those moments, but then find the most systemic place to engage people and point people in that direction. So simply not telling people in this moment to vote because their life depends on it, but finding the right places to move energy. And the way we've really thought about this for us as an organization that's responded all around the country as Black people have been harmed and hurt, oftentimes on video, and nothing has been done, is really to focus our energy around the country, here in this state and all around the place, on district attorney races. And so really thinking very clearly about what are we asking people to do and how are we making good on their political participation. Because I do think that we've gotten into this age where we ask people to engage, or we tell people that simply voting or simply participating will solve their problems, when in fact it's not true. There are a whole bunch of ways in which the structures that we currently operate in are designed for people's participation not to add up to power. And if we are not actually addressing those things as part of our activity, we are telling people untruths, and then we're confused on the back end when participation numbers are low or when people don't show up. It's almost like advertising great food on a menu, and then people get there and the food is not good, and then wondering why people don't continue to show up. And that's what we have with our system. And if we don't operate both on the structural level as well on the policy level, we're not going to see the type of change that we deserve.
So, Rashad, you said something really important, finding the systemic pivot point. And so, Erin, I would love for you to tell us, from your perspective, how do you engage in this process? But I know some of the work that you do is about actually finding the right pivot point for women, and so would love for you to talk about that.
Well, and thank you as well for being a part of today and seeing a lot of really great familiar faces that have helped to continue all of our work. To answer your first question, I would say feminist patriots, and the men who love them and the people who will get out of their way if we want to change democracy. And that pivot point particularly around that is women have been voting and outvoting their male counterparts for the last 20, 25 years. Particularly we saw African American women and almost every cohort around folks of color, you always see women participating. But what you don't see is that turn and pivot point to women actually running for office. It's like the sticky, floor or the glass ceiling. You have all of these women in middle management, and then we don't have enough CEOs. It's the same thing in politics. And so how do we actually get them to understand their political capital? Women have so much unspent political capital in this country. We are being asked to vote. We are thought of as the largest monolith right? That somehow we all vote the same way and follow the soccer ball across the field like a bunch of 5-year-olds learning how to play for the first time. When we are extremely diverse and yet have the ability, probably better than any other group, and 30 years of research shows this, to sit together at a coffee table, to come together at a political conversation and listen to one another and hear one another. And that is exactly what is needed in politics right now, those skills. And to do it in a way that says, I'm going to bring you along with me. So that transformative moment is, okay, you've voted. You've probably got more folks to vote on a recent ballot in your community, or for the first time you've turned out populations that have never turned out to vote before. And then you're handing over all your political capital to a bunch of people who look nothing like you, who have probably a very different economic background and have been expected to run for that political office and to sort of have that seat. We do a lot of work in rural America where these guys have been in public office for 30 years, and it's just Jim's seat. And then Jim Jr. is going to get it next. And nobody really even thinks that that's something you get elected for. That's just his job. He's just the state senator from rural Minnesota. And actually, it's telling them that they have the political capital and how to spend that political capital beyond voting. And so that's something that we're really working extremely hard to do. We use a lot of technology to do that. I know we're going to talk about that so that you don't feel so alone in that community. You don't feel like the only woman who's running in that race. Just had a conversation with a woman who's running for a state senate seat in Nebraska, and she said to me, I'm the only Blasian in my community, and I'll definitely be the first one if I ever get elected in Nebraska. And the only people I see who are, looking like me, I've got to find them on the web. Right? I've got to find them in some other places around the country. And so how do we connect those narratives of women who are doing it in different communities, inspire one another to do it, and then teach them how to spend that political capital? Because we can't have bad decisions anymore. People are not just vulnerable, it's dangerous right now. And so how do we make sure that they're not only getting in not because they're a woman, but because they're a transformative woman, because they are that feminist patriot who's going to look at democracy and say, it wasn't built by me, it wasn't built for me, but I'm about to rebuild it and I'm about to do it with others. And that's what we're doing for that sort of changing that transformative moment at Vote, Run, Lead.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So Gara, you can speak directly to the funders in the room with your funding cap. You're currently at the Democracy Alliance. Would love to hear your perspective on what are the ways that you're working on to build a more democratic participatory process.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's very nice to be back at Philanthropy New York. I still think of it as NIRAG. That's how far back I go. I want to say a couple things consistent with what everybody else has said or building on it. And at the end, I'll just tack on, and that is what philanthropy should do. The first thing I want to say is that, and it's important, I think, to be blunt about this because you can't really you can't deal with the problem unless the diagnosis is right. The history of this country is a history of systematic exclusion from democracy, right up to the present moment. So that is the story of America. The story of America is the franchise limited to white male property owners, and the expansion of that franchise to people of color, to women, has been to younger people, has been a constant struggle, which is not a historic struggle. It's a struggle that's going on right now with, and I think Rashad or others reference, voter ID laws. I mean, almost anything that can be done to make it more difficult for people to vote is being tried in a number of places today. With the effect of, and someone mentioned the criminal justice system, and I've been accustomed over the years, I've worked a lot through Open Society Atlantic and other places on the criminal justice system and also on democracy issues. And I have to say, as a kind of a mea culpa, that I never really saw them as closely connected until the last couple of years. I began to see them as closely connected when I was at Open Society, and we funded some work to investigate the impact of the felon disenfranchisement laws. And it turned out that in 3 southern states, former Confederate states, over a third of black men were permanently barred from voting because of that. And we did that study, or we funded that study, to dramatize mass incarceration, but it also dramatized a tremendous deficit in democracy, which, by the way, a couple of years after we did it, manifested itself in the presidential election of 2000, where the margin between Bush and Gore in Florida was certainly accounted for by the disenfranchisement of largely African-American prisoners in that state. So it has real democratic consequences. And if you are living in a penal state, you don't have full democratic rights. So those things are really coming together now. So the first thing I would say is that it's extremely important to understand that this war is going on and to invest in organizations that are fighting to expand the franchise and protect the franchise. And there are a number of them in this city and in this nation, and we can talk about that more later if you want. The second thing I want to say, which is also consistent with a number of things that have been said here, is that voting is an act, but it is an act in a continuum of citizenship. And if you look at voting as an isolated act, and you come into communities whose vote you want or whose vote you think is important to your side, only right before an election, we're not going to build the kind of democracy we need. And that has too often been, in my world, which now I have, I'm at the kind of intersection, if you will, of politics and philanthropy now. In my world, that is a constant problem of donors and parties and PACs and who act at the last minute and see communities of color, or for that matter, white rural communities, as kind of resources to be exploited and mined, So to me, where that leads is nothing against the more targeted voter registration activities that a lot of funders in this room have been leaders on. But I think what we need to do is is continue to invest more deeply in permanent, ongoing, political organization. I don't mean political organization necessarily in a partisan sense, but in communities. So, and this is particularly acute with respect to communities of color. So there is, virtually around the country, and I've learned a lot more about this in the last couple of years, Black and Latino, in particular, civic infrastructure in states, which are very critical, is just woefully, chronically underfunded. And when people say, well, you ask people, well, why aren't Black groups at the table, for this effort in this state, this key state? The answer often comes back from the largely white political structure. Well, they don't have enough C4 capacity or whatever. Well, that's a fixable problem. That's a problem that stems from chronic underinvestment. So Democracy Alliance is trying to do something about that, and we can talk more about that. But those are the two things I particularly want to stress here, which is that there are structural issues that have to do with voting. And you can look at the last election. People are explaining it in all kinds of different ways. But, there's also a story of successful voter suppression there. There's no accident that the laws that have been designed to make it more difficult for people to vote actually are working. And thank God we have the courts, and thank God we have social movements, and there's some signs that we're doing better on that. But that is a critical thing. Without that, it's hard to do anything else. So you have to work on both fronts. One is the structures which keep people from participating, and then you have to invest in communities so that voting is seen as something that people want to do because they feel it will have an impact and that they will be able to hold people accountable. If there's no connection there, people will learn, as Rashad says, that voting doesn't change much.
So I'm going to build on this idea of building the infrastructure that communities need to see voting and participation as more than just an act. And I want to start with, this is a question for the whole panel, but I want to start with Erin and Rashad. So what does it take, right? So what does it take to move people that have been historically marginalized and excluded communities to become active participants? And I think this idea of media and social media is really important because there's this idea that if you click like or you click whatever, a heart or whatever it is on the social media apps, that is active participation. And so I would love both of you to talk a little bit about what does it take to both move communities that have been marginalized or historically oppressed, but also this idea of using technology. How do we get people to be active?
So first of all, I think that, and I know this is always weird from an organization that does a lot of its work online, but I think we fetishize technology in a way that is really to our detriment in terms of really building power for communities. Movements have always used technology. They've always used the newest tools or tried to find the newest tools. The late Julian Bond used to tell this story of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee installing the Watts line in their Shore University office, which was the precursor to the 1-800 number, so they could avoid the sort of calling from operator to operator, because the White Citizen Council largely controlled the operators in the South, and their information would be intercepted. Also, Watts allowed them to make calls quicker. And so when they were calling information about sit-ins, they would write basically what they call the Watts report. And the Watts report was sort of the ways in which they communicated. Watts did not change their strategy. It was not their theory of change. It just allowed them to move information quicker. And so we should just be very clear about, when we sort of think about technology, that we don't sort of forget everything we know about strategy, about organizing, about building power, when we overlay new tools onto the work that we're supposed to be doing. What I will say in terms of, and I'll go back to the work around district attorneys, because I think it's really important in terms of both sort of picking up off of Gara's point of sort of moving from electoral work to accountability and sort of that sort of perspective, and because we have data that sort of really helps tell the story about people's participation in these races and why that's important. And so 85% of district attorneys in this country run unopposed. 90% of district attorneys are white. The incentive structure around district attorneys sort of feeling like they have to respond to the communities was completely off. Less than 1% of district attorneys in this country are women of color. When sort of the, within the Black community, the core to participation is Black women. And so we decided to electoralize district attorney races this cycle, not as some sort of, oh, we want people to vote on district attorneys, but because for the last several years, we have been trying to do accountability on DAs, and we have been making demands, and we were seeing that people were not listening to our demands, and so we felt like we then had to engage electorally. So that was a part of a strategic pivot to not just continue to ask our folks to do the same thing over and over again and hope that the DA suddenly woke up, or that they sort of like saw a good documentary on the criminal justice system and like suddenly believed that there was a problem with mass incarceration and that they were part of it. Like that we had to actually like make people lose their jobs, and communities actually had to feel like the participation that we were asking them to do was going to add up to something along the way. And so we worked with local communities, and by no means Color of Change was the only organization engaged, but we moved our members from simply like signing petitions and showing up to rallies and making phone calls to doing voter contact work. And that pivot required a different level of resource and a different type of money that can oftentimes be very hard for an organization like ours to raise. And so we had to raise a very different type of money, have a different type of structure in order to do that work. We picked DA races in different parts of the country, like Orlando, Chicago, Houston, where we were making good on movements that were already happening. But people were doing voter contact by phone and through the internet, gathering in places all around the country in cities where there were no DA races that we were engaging in. We had hundreds of people showing up on weekends to do contact into races where they didn't live for district attorneys, because we had sort of described a theory of change around people's participation and made it meaningful for people. And while we were explaining to the voters, we had to explain what DAs did, who their DA was. Once we got people to sort of see the connection between the district attorney and what was happening in their communities, we did some testing on the back end where we had controls, and then we tested it up against social pressure, meaning like people died for your right to vote, or these people in your community are voting and you're not, and we're going to like call you afterwards and show you that you didn't vote, up against the messages around a DA that was running on a clear reform message and addressing, and the reform message beat social pressure and beat the control. We did the same exact test back in 2014 with some support from our donors in 7 swing states around Senate races. And we tested basically similar messages around criminal justice reform and economic justice, sending out, doing a control and testing both that up against social pressure and the issues died. The community did not believe those candidates in those swing states actually cared about criminal justice. or economic justice? Because they actually weren't talking about it, nor did they have a record on it. So we were able to not only see an uptick in turnout just this last primary in Philadelphia around the district attorney race, we saw a huge uptick in youth participation and black participation for a district attorney primary race, where the community showed up and elected the lawyer for Black Lives Matter and Occupy to be the next DA in Philly. Like, this is sort of part of communities showing up in new ways, but that doesn't happen sort of in a vacuum. If we think about civic participation as this thing about like, oh, just vote, people want to vote, people want to engage to solve the problems that exist in their communities. And if you can give people a clear path, and now the path is we have a platform and we are showing up, and we are showing up to other DAs to hold them accountable, not just the ones we've elected. And that's how you start raising the floor on what's acceptable and start pushing up the ceiling on what's possible. And that's when people's participation actually matters.
And I would add on that pathway, specifically for women and asking them to run for office and encouraging to run for office, we have seen, technology is great because it can show you all the stories and numbers. So prior to the election, about 60% of our women were looking for a 5-year plan to run for office. After the election, about 60% of our women were looking to run right now. So that was, and that's something that because we're able to track and because we're able to use these tools and have more sort of instant conversations, we're able to take these anecdotes and then turn them into data that says, hey, I've got to shift my programming, I've got to do this different. But the 4 core pathways remain the same. If you had the opportunity to spend that political capital, what would you spend it on? Right? And getting women to think of themselves as the person who is in that potential seat, spending those resources. And so for us, that's the self. And for some women, that's a lack of confidence, never seeing anyone who's looked like me, thinking that that one remarkable woman is remarkable and unique in her own right, and I'm not anything like her. So making sure that we're bringing 15, 20 women, 30 women together to say, actually, I wore the wrong sock to work today. I forgot to drop my kid off. I was 25 minutes late for this, and just letting folks know that these are real people doing real things, and they're not this sort of mythical, remarkable woman, and making that happen at a very local community level. Our most famous local elected official, Ilhan Omar out of Minnesota, first Somali American elected to public office, continues to come back and show up on the web because she can't see everybody in variety in different refugee communities around the country, but makes it a point to get on so that her story can be heard. And that's one of those things that technology allows us to touch that story and make us feel a little more normal in that sort of self, I can do it too. The second piece is we have low political and electoral and civic literacy in this country. So 60% of those women who want to run, they don't know what they're running for, they don't know what government does, but they know they're mad as hell, and they're more likely qualified than the person who's been there before. So the good thing that has changed is women in qualifications across the board, they look up at our president and they see no military or political experience, and they say, heck, I can run for city council. So that's been a good shift for us, right? So how do we ramp up that civic literacy in a way that happens quickly? And technology allows us to do that in a faster way. So we are able to put out immediate courses based on the need that our constituents are asking for. On Saturday, the course is, what office should I run for? Because folks are like ready to get involved at this next level, but they don't know what the county treasurer does. They don't know what the district attorney does. They don't, they mostly know the city council, the school board, and the state ledge. So how do we actually show the kind of offices that are really critical and how you only need 3,500 votes and about $3,500 to actually get it done? So really demystifying that process and upping the civic literacy. The third is we don't want women in just for the sake of women in. We want transformers. So we need to be talking to them about systems like ranked choice voting, about multi-member districts, and saying when you get in office, you can make this change. These are things you can do from the inside out. Always, we close all of our panels with 2 things. One is, what's one thing you couldn't do as a citizen that you can do as an elected official, and why is it worth it? Because we have to change the narrative about what it means to be a public servant and to be a politician in this country. Because women are not interested in power for power's sake. Across the board, we're interested in power to do something so that 5 o'clock I can go home, see my family, and be proud of the work that I did that day. And I think, fourth is the campaign skills. We've got to make sure that women know how to run good campaigns. And right now what we're seeing, look at New Jersey, 100% of incumbents won in New Jersey. So we had a lot of influx of women running for office, but it didn't matter because incumbency is so, so strong. So how do we change some of that systems work? How do we get folks outside of the party systems to say, if it's only $3,500 to run for town supervisor, why actually do I have to go to the local Democrats? Because they've already picked Jim Jr. right? So it's $3,500 and 3,500 votes. How do I teach them how to get 50% plus one in a way that is outside of the traditional political systems? So those four things, to use technology to accelerate that education is great. To show them role models around the country who they might not see in their community is great. But also, I like tech because of the community aspect, and women go, "Ooh, I'm not crazy. There's someone else who's just like me." And it does allow us to have more of a flat communication. I'm able to make those connections between those two women, one who lives in rural Alabama and one who lives in Northern California, and they're able to have a conversation. So those are some of the ways that we're leveraging all of this, but it has to start, in the neighborhoods locally, and it has to remain at the community level.
So Tom, you want to jump in here in terms of how do we get historically marginalized or excluded communities, or communities that we don't see that often, to be, again, not just voting, but feeling like they're part of something, part of the bigger conversation?
Sure, and I agree with a lot of the comments that have been made up here. It's so important that we don't just think of this in terms of a political campaign, because let's be honest, the political class in this country is not afraid of you. And I don't care whether they're Democrats or Republicans. They're not afraid of you. Why? Because they know that in a political context, you're going to wake up 3 months before Election Day, and you're going to start agitating, and you're going to start making noise, and maybe you'll try and run somebody for office. But they feel like they can weather that storm. So one of the things that we try to do is to focus on the times when historically people aren't talking. What's going on during the legislative session? Let's say it's a state ledge race. What's going on in that legislative session? How do we communicate during the first 6 months of the year, not just the last 6 months of the year? And that requires really tough local spade work, because the digital is very important, and we focus on digital a lot. We had over 15 million digital impressions as an organization in the state of New York last year. But the key is making sure that you're driving out those messages and that education to drive up awareness, and some would say drive up the negatives of people that you're trying to move. Either you're trying to move their activity in office, or you're going to set them up at some point for a political organization to come in and ultimately give them a good challenge, give them a primary, or get them out. What you need to do is focus on now taking those people who clicked like or put their emoji on the on Facebook, or they reacted on Facebook, and then move them to some sort of civic action. We used the Freedom of Information Law on a statewide level at Reclaim New York as a method to try and get people in local communities to get local government to open up their books. So you've got your activist core, okay, and those are people who are your low-hanging fruit, and they've clicked like, they've seen it, they've reacted, they've engaged you in some fashion. Now you have to move them from that very simple method to maybe something that's a little bit more concrete. And that's either going to a town board meeting, that's writing a letter to the editor, and all of this stuff isn't going on within the context of a campaign. It's going on before the campaign even starts. And so this is, and I know there are a lot of people who sort of bemoan the 24/7 nature of the way public policy and politics work in this country. But when you've got a political class where over 90% of the incumbents are getting elected, where in some places, people are being underserved, but there is no choice on the ballot because people are not running for office, and we don't have term limits, so we're not really truly opening up the process and forcing people by the operation of law out of office. You do need to look at this as a sustained type of communication, where you're talking to people at a local level about issues that matter to them, and you are trying to bring them along from just that to going to a rally, to picking up the phone and calling their elected official, to writing that letter to the editor, to going to the town board meeting and speaking. And it's tough spade work. There's so many of the donors out there, they love to say, oh, you know what, that's great, but let me just put money into television ads. right? How many times has somebody dumped money into the black hole of television rather than taking even 10% of those resources and putting it into infrastructure building and doing it outside of the campaign cycle? And this is a choice that's made by donors all the time on both sides of the aisle. But if we really do want to reclaim our government and take back control, we have to be doing that in January, February, March, and April, not just in September, October, and November.
So, Tom, you said issues that matter to them, right? The them, again, we're not talking about the faceless voters, but to them, right? To particular communities. And Gara, I'd love to start with you and move our way down. So in this work of building a more transparent and democratic process, there's natural competing interests, right? And so there's these inherent tensions between national groups and local groups and a more traditional way of thinking of the United States and the ever-changing face of the new American majority. There's national forces and global forces. How do we use technology and how does it impact the future of work, right? So there's all of these tensions. And given our limited resources, financial, human, and otherwise, I'd love to hear all of your opinions, starting with Gara, of what are the trade-offs? What do we focus on? What's most important? Because to your point, we're talking to them, the voters, about the issues that matter to them. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on what are the trade-offs, given the current financial, human resources that we have.
Well, I thought I would be the last speaker in the last series, so I prepared all my thoughts on that rather than the first speaker in a new series. But let me see if I can pivot, okay, because it's all about pivoting, right? So I want to answer that question with the answer I would have given to the last question, which is what a good politician does. So, and that is this. Of course, there are choices to be made, and I understand that. Philanthropy is all about being strategic and having good metrics, and you can't do everything and so on. But I want to kind of offer a different model, which I think is more suitable to the kind of discussion we're having, and that is when I came in here. Or when I was looking at it from the green room, there was only one word on the screen, and that was leadership. I think that, and of course, your organization in essence is about that. I think that investing in good leadership is really the most critical thing you can do. So, I'm seated on the far right, I guess, depending on where you're sitting. And I've learned a lot from the right. I mean, even though, I seem to be identified as a figure on the left, I've learned a lot from conservative philanthropy. I do actually think, Tom, that people fear. There are some people who do fear the electorate. Tea Party's done a very good job of that, of creating a dynamic within the Republican Party where people really do look over their right shoulder, to primary challengers. In this city, we do have term limits, which is not something I'm generally always a fan of, but the combination of term limits, very, very robust public financing of elections, and strong independent political organizations like the Working Families Party has actually led not only to significant turnover in the New York City Council, but probably, as diverse a city council in a variety of ways as you have anywhere in the country, and as progressive a city council. So the fact that somebody has a D next to their name or a blue on the map does not make them, progressive. And the Tea Party realized this on the Republican side, and I think more and more people are realizing it on the Democratic side. So I think I'll go back to the point I made in the first question, which is I think the building of infrastructure that is led by communities that are traditionally marginalized and underfunded is the most important thing that funders can do for democracy. Because in my view, the history of successful philanthropy is the investment over years in organizations that have the resources to make the choices that they wish to make. Now, it helps if those organizations have a more democratic, in a small d sense, funding base, right? So look at the current moment. of the so-called resistance. There are new formulations springing up that are disrupting things and changing the landscape, but there are historic organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union or Planned Parenthood or the Sierra Club. They've been around for 100 years, have a strong brand, a strong funding base, and have been well positioned to seize the current moment because they have been invested in over those years, and because those investments have not only been made steadily by philanthropy, but also have been made by ordinary people with small dollars. The vast majority of the ACLU's significant donations since the election have come from people, from very small dollar donors. And we don't have, and it's a broader challenge for philanthropy that we all need to work on, we need to democratize the funding, in this world. But since we don't have that right now, the message I would always give is to identify organizations and institutions nationally and locally that have a kind of a political analysis that reflect the voices and the direction of the communities most affected. And if you, just to close on the right-left thing, if you look at and I have studied and I have pretty good relationships with my counterparts on the right, in philanthropy in particular, the story of successful conservative philanthropy is not a story of, we'll give you a grant for 3 years and then you're out. It is not a story of rigorous metrics. It is not a story of foundation designed in a laboratory programs that are then imposed upon the grantees. It is a story of identifying key institutions, giving them general support, forever, and that is what has enabled those institutions to become powerful. I mean, I'll close by saying that I've always told this joke that on the right and the left kind of switch identities with respect to. So the right, thinks the welfare mother, should get off welfare, pull herself up by the bootstraps, and so on, and yet they fund their organizations generously and indefinitely with almost no, real metrics. The left believes something about society, about, you need to have a supportive system for people and so on, and you need to, you can't be cutting people off, but they treat their grantees like the right treats the proverbial welfare mother. So it'd be good to do a kind of a Freaky Friday kind of switch, I think, would be very good.
Well, and I want to build a little bit off that in the leadership. I shared with the panelists before the conference an article about the difference between the progressives and conservatives funding leadership development, and it was something like 130 million on the conservative side and about 16 million on the progressive side. And as someone who leads a nonpartisan organization committed to women's political leadership, we can't have women's leadership actually fall in either this idea that that's progressive or that's conservative. We're really working towards a time where it's completely normal for women to be in power. But right now, unfortunately, we have this dynamic where, gender and women's leadership is pretty much seen as a progressive cause in the name of progress, as it should be. But we tend, in this leadership development, to really hold this idea of building leaders as if there's some sort of magical formula. It's like producing a movie. You can produce a bunch of movies and you spend a lot of money. Only one of those movies is really going to pop off. But it's a high risk but high reward area to fund. And so I think the more progressive side has treated folks on the leadership development work as a little bit like, what's your magical formula? Let's see it. How does it include digital technology? What we're really looking for is individuals at any given time in their lives to actually say, I'm the one. And for a lot of folks, that comes at various different moments in their political life cycle. And to fund those institutions with deep and sustained funds allows that sort of magical moment to happen when it happens for the right person. And I know you see that a lot, Rashad, in your work, where it's surprising to say, hey, this person has actually decided to throw their hat in the ring, or this person's decided to lead that ballot initiative. When you are working with unusual suspects, the unusual leaders will come in that same pattern. And so I encourage all of you to really think differently about how we see and work with leadership development.
The quick thing I'll say about sort of the relationship to philanthropy that Color of Change has and sort of the way in which it impacts our model is that 11 years ago when Color of Change was founded, if the founder of Color of Change did not have his own money to start the organization, it wouldn't have been started. And if it had been started sort of in the laboratory of foundation world, it probably might not exist anymore. And so for the first 2 years, our founder funded the organization, him and his wife, out of their own pockets, basically, with a couple of small grants in like after the first year of really sort of having some success. It allowed us to create a model that wasn't about $30,000 and $50,000 checks to work on this like criminal justice bill over here, or this sort of economic justice idea that a foundation had over here, but to build a model and to be able to like prove a theory of change. And as a result, a lot of our resources do come as general operating funds, which allows us to make the type of flexible decisions and build on opportunities and seize opportunities. And so many times folks will come to us after a campaign and say, we want to fund you to do the next campaign like that over here. We had this idea that you could do something. Like, well, you didn't have the last idea. We had that idea. We built that. And so you saw that, and now you want us to like build that palm tree in Central Park instead of allowing us to figure out what tree needs to grow in Central Park. And so when institutions are successful, how do you trust them to build on that success and build on that model so they can do sort of the next thing and the next thing and build on that? And it doesn't mean that advice and feedback and evaluation is not important, but it does mean that that is not how any field innovates. It's not how new platforms are built in any other world. And so I do think that sort of how we've become an organization. I took over 6 years ago with a $650,000 budget. We now have about an $11 million budget between our multiple platforms. And that did not happen because like foundations were giving us a bunch of ideas about a bunch of campaigns. It happened because there were a number of leaders in philanthropy that trusted us to be the innovators of our own liberation.
Mm-hmm.
You had asked about how do you make choices, as particularly,
Yep.
and there is a great diversity of causes and issues that are represented by the philanthropies here. From our perspective, what we felt like what we needed to do was to, and I think this is something that's good for everybody, is to figure out how you're going to mainstream your issue. All right, if you're one of these poor, unfortunate people that you watch cable news all day or listen to talk radio, you would be under the misimpression that people are either over here or they're over here. But the fact of the matter is that from a sustainability standpoint for your organization, you need to be talking to the people who are here, right? So you've got to figure out a way to not only address your activist core, which would be on one side or the other, people who are already engaged, but these folks in the middle and mainstreaming is so important. It's one of the reasons why we started off talking about affordability. Can people afford to live in this city and in this state? What are people going through to be able just to make their bills? And how does government impact that? And let's start a conversation about it. So it was a way for us in a very nonpartisan context to start talking to the broadest range of people as possible and start educating them and starting a broader conversation. I think that's really important to ensuring that over the long term, you can build that infrastructure, you can reach beyond your base, and you can see some real movement on your issue.
So I'm about to get the wrap-up yellow flag to stop talking, but I want to ask the panel just for one last thing. So, in philanthropy, we are notorious, as you guys know, for living and funding in silos, right? There's the education funders, there's the health funder, there's the young people funder, there's the community development funder, almost as though like our lives exist in like neat little silos, which mine doesn't. I don't know about anybody else's, but my life doesn't exist that way. So I just, few comments on what would you all say to funders that are like really siloed, right? That are not funding voter engagement, community organizing, democracy, or democratic participation. How does this work show up in their in their life and their funding. So I know it's a huge question, but you all are fabulous. So
I think that it goes back to your messaging challenge, and that is when you're going to the donor, you're going to the prospective funder, is making your issue relevant to the issue that they care about. Because I know how terrible it is when somebody says, well, I only care about healthcare, so I don't care about you. But the fact of the matter is that there's something that you're working on that could very well be relevant to what they're funding in healthcare and how they're managing the healthcare debate or the healthcare issue. So I think that it is a matter of how to make it relevant for those donors.
Well, I mean, I'm all for. I have nothing against focus, and I realize that everybody has their mandate and their donors, the issues they care about, and everything can't be about everything else. So I just went the other night to the splendid launch of the Art for Justice initiative that Aggie Gund and Ford and some other funders are involved with, and they're focused on mass incarceration. So if someone came to them and said, you should work on climate change, well, no, they won't. But I tell you what, I think it is important to have an analysis that is all-encompassing. So in other words, I think you need to be seeing the work you do in some larger ecosystem. Now, there's some funders and organizations that have a great deal of breadth, and they're trying to fund. I mean, I've headed a couple of very large foundations where, even though we made choices, we had a kind of a broad range. We did a lot of things across what have been considered silos, and we had the challenges that any of you who work in bigger foundations with different program areas have, which is how to make those internally work together. It's a classic issue. There's no funder that's gotten it perfectly. But so I'm not saying everybody should be about everything. If you're running a foundation that has $10 million a year to spend, you best be, relatively focused. But it seems to me your analysis of how your niche fits into a larger system is very important, and you ought to be working with people in other pieces of that ecosystem so that it all kind of hangs together. So it's not about everybody doing everything, or everybody should just put all their general support money into broad-based organizations. That won't be for everybody. Philanthropy is very pluralistic. It's going to remain so. But it is important to have an analysis which is fairly clear on where your piece of it does fit into the larger picture.
Any final words?
I want to do just a nod to the women's funds and foundations around the country. I think it's such an interesting model. I know you're going to hear from Anna Oliver from the New York Women's Foundation. We have been funded and partnered with the women's funds and foundations across the country, which means we get access to their grantees. They are endorsing our work. They're coming together as a small network to say, how can the five big groups actually work together to move X? So I would encourage all of us to look at that model. Those funds and foundations are doing an extremely amount of efficient work with a much smaller amount of money. So add a zero to any gift you want to give to the women's funds and foundations.
So, folks, help me thank our opening panel: Tom Basile, Rashad Robinson, Erin Velarde, Gara LaMarche.
Good morning. I'm Ana Oliveira. I want to thank Erin for a smooth transition. I'm the president of the New York Women's Foundation, a very proud board member of Philanthropy New York, and I was so delighted to be part of the committee that planned today. So I want to thank my fellow committee members. I want to thank the staff of Philanthropy New York for putting together an incredible day for all of us. So we are going to go now to something really important that Philanthropy New York does, and that's the Phil Talks. Talking about the power of participation and talking about, pluralism and democracy, it's so important to have the voice of leadership in a very permeable manner surface. And what Phil Talks does is exactly that. It was created 5 years ago. So, we've been in that track of creating opportunities for us to hear from leaders that are doing incredible work. Today, I'm going to be introducing to you 4 incredible speakers. They're going to do 3 different talks, but they all talk about the power of participation. And I was very inspired by the panel that we just listened to about, I'm going to say, the issue of authenticity that permeated so much of the conversation, the authenticity of participation and the authenticity of engagement and voice. So I'm going to introduce each speaker as we go along, and you're going to have an opportunity to listen to them. And if at the end we have time, we will ask them all a joint question together. So I'm going to begin by introducing Afia Atamensa, who is the Executive Director of Community Voices Heard, a member-led multiracial organization here in New York City and beyond. Please welcome Afia. We are very fond of you and of Community Voices Heard. It's an organization that builds collective power to secure economic, racial, and social justice for all. So it's a membership-driven participation in power. There are, in the programs you have, there are very good bios of our speakers. So I'm not going to be able to really cover all that. But I do want to say that in addition to Afia's leadership at Community Voices Heard, she is an attorney who has worked on behalf of communities for organizations such as the Urban Justice Center, the Center for Working Families, and the Legal Aid Society. Please welcome Afia.
When you hear the phrase welfare, what are some of the first thoughts that come into your mind? For most people, those words would be stereotypes. Lazy, liars, uneducated. Don't act like I'm the first person to say this, right? Now, you may not have thought that, but those stereotypes were definitely part of the national narrative in 1994 when my organization was founded. My name is Afia Atamensa, and I'm the Executive Director of Community Voices Heard. Now, when we were founded, at that time, some of the most draconian aspects on the war on the poor were being enacted across this country. Right here in New York City, then Mayor Giuliani was actually considering legislation that would put the children of women on welfare in orphanages. Under the guise of putting people back to work, the Work Experience Program was created. Instead of allowing people on welfare to go to school so that they could get the basic skills and earn the degrees they needed to actually get high-wage jobs that would really lift people out of poverty, they were told to report to the Parks Department so they could pick up trash throughout the park, or else their benefits would be cut. In fact, several of our founding members were at the time enrolled in area universities and told they had to drop out of school and go to the Parks Department. You know, despite that vitriolic narrative of their day, our members, these so-called welfare moms, were crystal clear about the power of participation, right? They formed an organization after an inaugural meeting of 80 people that would allow them to build power. To this day, we use the model that they created on that fateful night: fighting for our communities, fighting for our families, and fighting for ourselves. So we've evolved from an organization that had one office in New York City that focused on welfare rights to a statewide organization with offices in New York City, Westchester, Dutchess, and Orange County. We work on a myriad of campaign issues. Some of our core issues are affordable housing, immigration reform, climate justice, jobs, youth, participatory democracy. I still remember the first time I came in contact with someone from CVH. At the time, I was a public defender. So after my mornings in court, sometimes I was charged with going to these coalition meetings. And at these meetings would be heads of social service agencies, policy wonks, heads of city agencies. And so on this day, right, in the meeting, you know how it goes. You introduce yourself, your title, the organization you're with. And this one person introduced himself as an organizer for Community Voices Heard. The two women next to him identified themselves as members of Community Voices Heard. Now, when they walked in, I immediately recognized them because they're the only other people of color, and I was like, finally, right? And at that meeting, there was a consultant from a city agency, and he had a policy idea that would help eliminate poverty. And his idea was, what you have to do is get rid of public housing. You see, public housing is a scourge, and the only thing that happens there is poverty, and you got to just demolish it and sprinkle the people around. And I will never forget it. The CVH member, her name was Ann Bragg, she raised her hand. She looked at him and she said, who did you talk to when you did this? I said, what? I talked to the head of the housing authority and other housing authorities in major cities and crunched the data. And then she looked at him and said, well, who paid you for this? He said, I'm a city consultant. She looked down the table at me. She said, baby, you a lawyer. Can we sue the city for wasting my tax dollars on this nonsense? And went down the line and just gave a point-by-point rebuttal of how farcical what he said was. And then said, you know, we have our own policy prescription, and laid it down. So after that, the meeting was pretty much over, right? I made a beeline for Ann Bragg. I was like, yo, what is CVH? She said, we're not a service organization. We're member-led, we're base building, and we're building power so we can win our campaigns. At that moment, I was like, yes, yes, yes. How can I be down? Is there like an email listserv that I can get on? I was immediately recruited, right? And it was that moment of seeing women of color coming into a space, changing the dynamic. They were so clear on their brilliance and power, even if the world wasn't ready for it. See, and right now as a nation, we're grappling with what happens when folks don't feel powerful, right? And with all we have going on right now and the mound of what we have to face, we have to do more than just say resist. You see, at CVH, we are building something. We're building a revival. We are unabashed about having a multiracial membership base. We place a premium on a true black and brown coalition. Okay? Now, how are we building this revival? At Community Voices Heard, we subscribe to a relational organizing method, right? And in that method, it requires you to sit down and talk to someone and share your story, and then invite that person to share their story with you, right, so you can listen. Now, I want to say something to you. At a time when we sit across from breakfast tables and text the person across from us to pass the Cheerios, talking to somebody is damn near a revolutionary act, okay? So we take those conversations so we can find these common threads, and those common threads allow us to build upon showing that we have some common interests and that maybe some of our fights are inextricably linked. This conversation, this one-on-one, is the elemental step that allows us to build a base, to build a movement, to build our revival. Now, this work ain't sexy. It is essential. It is like the lifeblood of how we make our revival. I want you to be clear. This is how we get a mass of people to become woke. Base building is a contact sport, right? Just getting that initial engagement with someone is hard work. We have to knock 50 doors just to get 20 people who will talk to you. Out of that 20, maybe 12 will talk to you and want to do something more than just identify their problem and move to action. Change movements are built by a small cadre of people. We find those people. Those are our CVH members. We provide them training and support so that they can find others of their ilk. We then have them go out and talk to other people and bring them back to CVH to teach power analysis and strategy. You see, we knock on these doors because we know behind those doors may be the next Fannie Lou Hamer. We knock on doors because behind those doors are people like Cynthia Gilkerson. Cynthia is a CVH member from our Orange County chapter. She's a mother of 3, and she became a member after doing a one-on-one with an organizer. And during that session, she talked about her concerns regarding a mental health clinic that was scheduled to close in Orange County. She was scared, right? She didn't know what to do. As many of you know, there's a stigma around mental health issues in this country. The organizer challenged her to say, you have to go out there and share your story so that she could learn that she wasn't alone in this, rather that this was a shared problem. And she did. And lo and behold, many people in her neighborhood shared that same concern. So we had to move then from building that base to moving the base to action. Cynthia started as a woman who was scared to even name that she had mental health issues, to building a base that was demanding meetings with members of the New York State congressional delegation, to demand that they put money to keep mental health services open. Thereafter, that base of people who were in solidarity with the collective idea about keeping that clinic open had a accountability session with the Orange County Health Commissioner. And as Cynthia notes, we were able to keep that clinic open. And if they come back, CVH will be ready. On the other side of those doors are people like Wendy Ceballos. Wendy is a member of Community Voices Heard. She's part of our Westchester chapter. We got involved with Wendy after she attended an anti-poverty assembly we were having in Port Chester. She became a member after having a one-on-one with the organizer. And during that session, she talked about how hard it was for her as a single mother. She worked two jobs to put food on the table. And because she worked so much, she really needed affordable after-school care. That organizer pushed Wendy and said, listen, you should go out, talk to people, share your story, determine whether or not other people need affordable childcare. As the mom of a 4.5-year-old, any parents, put your hands up. Don't be scared, okay? Getting affordable childcare is a problem that many people share. So Wendy was able to find this base, but again, we had to move them just from identifying a problem to action, right? And action can be terrifying, particularly for the base that Wendy was initially building, undocumented women. Part of the analysis that she came to learn at CVH is that we needed to build a larger network, a network of people that were more invested in childcare for their children than in any racial or other issues that may divide us. You see, we won that campaign. And I'm proud to say we win campaigns at CVH. We win campaigns not just because our ideas are better. They are. We win campaigns because we have invested in people to move them, right, from a token participation to a powerful participation, where they are transformed in that space. And then, just like happened to me in that first meeting with someone for CVH, I was transformed, I was recruited. We believe in this model and believe that it will help us set this nation on a proper trajectory. Every day of the week at CVH, we bet on people. And we haven't lost yet. Thank you.
Thank you, Afia. Thank you. Our next Field Talk presenter is Jeff Jarvis. Jeff is a professor and director of the Toll Knight Center for Entrepreneurial Journalism at the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism. Recently, Jeff started the News Integrity Initiative, funded with $14 million by Facebook, the Craig Newmark Philanthropy Fund, Mozilla, the Democracy Fund, the Knight, Ford, and Toll Foundations, and several other funders. So Jeff is here to present to us. Please welcome Jeff.
Thank you, Athea. That was just really great and hard to follow. So I think I'm here because I used to earn money and then I begged for money and now I get to give money away. And so I find myself suddenly being a funder like you. And I want to give you a little bit of the genesis of how this came about and then talk about this issue of fake news. After the election, as you all know, a lot of money became available, or as I like to say, put my hand out and I got some, around this notion of what the hell do we do about an informed public and an informed public conversation and the manipulation of it. So I talked to my friend Craig Newmark, who I've known for some years, and he invited a proposal. We gave him a proposal about looking at the public conversation rather than just looking at the platforms or media companies. He quickly approved it, and then suddenly out of nowhere, Facebook called and said, we're looking to do more around journalism. What are you doing? I said, we're setting up this structure with Craig. They said, we like structure. So we got more money. Then Ford came along, and then the other funders you heard about. So now we have this organization. And I want to tell you just a minute or so about the governance of it, because I think you'll find that interesting and necessary. So yes, I'm working with Facebook, and I'm working with others as well, including companies. And so we work very hard to make the governance work such that we have independence at CUNY. But at the same time, we want to be able to collaborate with Facebook and Google and the platforms and try to be a bridge for them with publishers and with others. So we have a small executive committee made up of me, a representative of Facebook, and Craig Newmark. We have a veto power over certain actions on that committee so that we can make sure that we have independence. And I just hired, I'm privileged to have hired Molly D'Aguiar, who many of you I'm sure know from the Dodge Foundation, and my friend Chris has been nice enough not to shoot me as a result as the head of Dodge. So Molly is going to be very independent and report directly to our dean, Sarah Bartlett. So that's our structure. We are going to fund research that informs our work, projects, which is the main focus, and events at a local, national, international level. What the heck can we do that others aren't doing? Well, I spoke last night on the phone with someone from the Hewlett Foundation who's doing incredible work in this and doing amazing things. I was at the Media Impact Funders meeting in Washington where there are others doing this. So it's critical, obviously, that we come together and compare notes and understand what we're doing and collaborate as funders and collaborate as researchers. So what I really want to talk to you about now is what the hell do we do about this? I don't know if you've heard of Data and Society, a wonderful think tank in New York run by Dana Boyd, who's just brilliant. They did a report about 2 weeks ago on manipulation of media, and it's changed my notion of what we're about here. Because if we talk about fake news as a piece of bad content that we have somewhere, then we tend to try to find ways to just tamp it down like whack-a-mole. But the truth is, we are being manipulated by an array of actors who have related but separate motivations, but who what they share is techniques and tactics. And so Data and Society's report lists the taxonomy of the bad guys: trolls, gamergaters, so-called men's rights activists, alt-right, white nationalists, and so on. It lists where they work. They work up through 4chan and 8chan, into Breitbart, into Alex Jones, who will be seen on TV Sunday, unfortunately, up through Fox, up into CNN. Because at the point it reaches CNN, they're saying, well, everybody's talking about this, we have to cover this. And thus we are giving the bad guys just exactly what they want, which is attention. Dana Boyd from Data and Society also taught me that part of the problem here is that the paradox we're stuck in is that when we in journalism do our jobs, we play into their hands. We play into their hands by giving them attention. Even when we fact check and debunk them, that's what they want. They want enemies. So what the heck do we do? Then I also read a report, as odd as this sounds, a NATO handbook on Russian information warfare. It was chilling in that it was an exact script for what we are recognizing now, what we are going through now. And the goal of, and I'm not trying to say that Russians are in charge of everything, maybe the White House, we don't know, we'll find out soon, but not everything. But again, the techniques are similar because they're learning from each other and we in institutions aren't learning from them. We are holding ourselves back and above and separate from it, saying, well, they're playing that dirty little game, but they're having a conversation with the public that we're not having. They're going into Facebook and talking to people in their conversations where they are. We're not doing that. They're creating memes and other mechanisms that people can pass around on their own in their conversations. We don't do that. We write articles still. And we tell people you have to come to us to be blessed with the news. We create programs in news literacy, which is a fine thing, and I'll support some of that. But I'm also concerned that news literacy is media-centric and says to the public, if you read our news, you're literate, and if you don't, you're not. It's media-centric. So the Russians don't see cyber warfare. They see information sphere as all the same, and that allows them to operate across the internet to mainstream media in a psychological sense. There's also a RAND Corporation report. I know I'm sounding paranoid now reading RAND and NATO, but this is our world. I'll get my tooth transmitting out in a second. So the RAND report points out that if you deal in falsehood, you have the advantage of speed, because getting facts takes time. Making up facts up doesn't take any time. And thus the bad guys get out there fast and they set the agenda. They also have the advantage of volume, because they can make crap up and they can create bots that will spread that around. So that's the world in which we now live. And we've got to come up with new strategies to figure it out. And that's what I hope the News Integrity Initiative can help do, is to understand how to build those strategies. So I'll list a couple things really quickly, and then I'll get off stage. First is we need awareness of what is happening. We in media especially, but across, I just ran some sessions for the World Economic Forum in San Francisco a week ago, and I found that corporations are aware of these kinds of manipulation targets but they're only aware of what affects them. We in media aren't really aware at all. Storiful, I funded a piece that Storiful wrote arguing that major news organizations should have a 4chan correspondent, should have someone who is digging into this horrible underbelly and give that person combat pay to figure out what's going on and what's coming next. What are they going after next? Then the next thing we have to do is to share information. I think that every news organization should have, or major news organization should have a network of security officers who are watching out for what's happening, who are informing the newsroom so they know when they're getting used. There should be a network among them. Same thing for corporations. Same thing for NGOs. Government, I'm not so sure what to do about right now. But we've got to be more aware of what's happening so that we're savvy about this. Next, we have to get ahead of it. The RAND report says that if we try, what we try to do is people are spewing misinformation over here, so we try to spew facts over there. No, we're never going to win because of speed and volume. We have to get ahead. So one of the things they're going after soon is the US Census, because they want to devalue that. At the World Economic Forum meetings, I heard someone very smart, Chatham House rules, so I won't say who, say that his fear is what's going to come next is a tax on the pillars of society. Doctors, accountants, judges. Gee, what has Trump been doing about judges in his tweets? Another fear that communities, which I think are the bedrock of this in the safety zone, another smart person in San Francisco said, well, no, if you watch community behavior online now, you see that anyone who has an opinion that diverges from the orthodoxy of the community is treated as a shill, and the bloodstream evicts them. So communities of diversity aren't necessarily the bedrock that I had hoped, because they're not diverse, because they make themselves not diverse. So we have to get ahead. We should be recovering right now and saying the census is a great thing. It is a necessary thing. It is well done, though God knows since the head just left. But we have to get ahead of what the bad guys are going to do. That's what we do in journalism. We have to learn from the bad guys. We have to use some of the techniques that they use so that we can understand how to do this stuff ourselves. I have argued even to Nick Kristof, who's a neighbor of at my office on 40th Street, and I ran into him and I said, you know, what you should do next, Nick, is memes. Do memes, young man. Now, I'm not suggesting that Nick should stop writing his columns. But what you see now is that, not because of me, but the Times is now doing little gifts, boxes, that have an idea, an action, a fact in them that can be passed around. I'm going next week to a wonderful conference called VidCon, which is 25,000 YouTube fans, mainly young women, including my daughter. And I learned at VidCon in the last 2 years that when my daughter shares a video, she's not saying, this is a very good product, you should sit and watch. She's saying, this speaks for me. It's part of her conversation. So how do we learn what the bad guys are doing and make journalism and facts and truth and sense part of people's conversations by feeding them in that? We have to change journalism fundamentally to do that. And the first thing we have to do is listen better. We are crappy listeners. I started a new program at CUNY in social journalism, which is predicated on the idea that we must listen first. Finally, we have to rebuild trust in media and in other institutions. And that's going to take a long time. That's a longer-term project, obviously. It means that we have to change those institutions fundamentally, and that's the longer-term goal. So trust and manipulation are the two goals we're going to attack at the News Integrity Initiative. Trust is the important initiative. It's the long-term one. But in the short term, we have an emergency. If we don't deal with manipulation, these institutions may not live to reinvent themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. So now we come to our final Phil Talk this morning, and that is by a team representing the Theater of the Oppressed in New York City. Katie Rubin is the executive director, and Devin Manibo is the community engagement coordinator. Katie is also the founder of the Theater of the Oppressed in New York City, worked with Augusto Boal in Rio in Brazil. And I want to say it's very dear to my heart that you do this work. I grew up and benefited. I grew up with the incredible power of the Theater of the Oppressed in Brazil at the time. And Katie not only trained with Augusto Boal, but also has trained others in Nicaragua, in the Netherlands, Norway, Australia, and across the United States. Devin is an alum of the incredible Innovative Cultural Advocacy Fellowship at the Caribbean Cultural Center and Africa Diaspora Institute in New York City, a graduate of Hampshire College, having studied new media, performance, and queer studies. Please welcome them.
Thank you. Hi. I'm Katie.
I'm Devin.
And we're here in our constant pursuit of fun in social justice. And that's also why we advocated to have two of us here, because two is more fun than one. And also why we're working the orange today, because that's really fun. So orange, and there we go. So kicking it off. So in my quest for fun in social justice started when I was a kid. I used to work in the circus and be a stilt walker, and that was fun. And I also used to, I was a part of a family that engaged in a lot of activism. So we, went on marches and protests, sometimes on stilts, and also engaged in civil disobedience when I was older. And I remember going, getting dragged to some meetings of activists, arguing about the best way to make social change, fighting with each other about, what kind of sit-in we should do. And
that really sounds like a drag.
Yeah.
Like you were really dragged there,
I
like
was
on many
dragged
levels.
there, right. And it really wasn't fun. And not only that, but I thought that was not a model for the world that I thought these folks were trying to create. And the people in the room didn't always reflect the problems they wanted to be working on.
Right.
So
what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, right. Didn't find it yet. And then when I was 21, I discovered Theater of the Oppressed and met Augusto Boal. And so Theater of the Oppressed was started by Boal in the 60s and 70s in Brazil and South America, and now is practiced all over the world. Mm-hmm. And the way it works is that communities facing oppression build plays about their lived experiences, perform them for their peers and their neighbors and strangers who are not just spectators, but are also spect-actors. Yes, because they, right, all of us are actors and spect-actors. They are invited to join the actors on stage and improvise, try out new ideas, new solutions to the problem in the moment, a rehearsal for reality. And then everybody engages in critical analysis dialogue about those ideas and how to make them really move forward. So that was fun. And then I went to Brazil when I was 22 for several months to train at the Center for Theater of the Oppressed in Rio. And there I saw Theater of the Oppressed being used in institutions, by institutions of the government, like the education system and the mental health system and the prison system, right? Funded by those institutions and then critiquing them. So I went to a play in what they called a prison for the criminally insane, which was an institution that looked like a prison for people with mental illness who had been convicted of any kinds of crimes. And the man who I saw perform a play with his peers had been arrested, had been living in this institution for 30 years because he was convicted of stealing a chicken. And he had never been released because he didn't have family to accept him. And so I was at a play where he was performing that story and also now his trouble getting access to healthcare in that institution. And there were prison officials, corrections officers, and officials in the audience who had to think about how those problems relate to their own lives and then had to think, what would I do in that moment? And maybe even, am I going to get up on stage and try something? And I had never seen that kind of boundary breaking and that kind of creative idea making for real entrenched problems ever before.
Sounds pretty fun to me.
Yeah, it was entirely fun. And then I was like,
how are you going to bring that here?
Yeah,
right?
Where is that happening in New York, which is my home and my neighbors? And it is happening in the United States, but not to that extent and not really in institutions when I got back. So really kind of without much planning, Theater of the Oppressed NYC started in 2010-11 when a small homeless outreach program on a church on the Upper East Side, the Anhus Homeless Outreach Program, called and said, we have a crew of folks who want to make a play. And we made one play called It Could Happen to You, and all of a sudden that turned into a tour of shelters and soup kitchens. And all of a sudden folks were calling us up and asking if other organizations could do the same thing, like Housing Works, like the Ali Fournet Center, like the Fortune Society, like the Center for Court Innovation, like CASES, like the IRC, all of those kinds of organizations. And like Hedrick Martin Institute up here. And here we are, 2017, performing 60 plus free forum plays a year for 3,000 plus audience members, every single one generating 3 or 4 creative ideas and then engaging in critical analysis about that with several hundred actors from communities all year long. So it's a lot of fun.
It is.
But at some point, a couple years in, we got frustrated. Because we're having these performances, you know, like somebody's coming up and trying to convince the HRA worker to give them their food stamps.
It's not always going to get you where you need to get.
Right. Like, is the HRA worker having a good day or not? Right? That's not the way that change is made. And all the audience members and the actors were like, okay, so we can talk to each other, but actually some of these problems are structural. And they're about the rules and the systems that are holding these problems in place.
So how are we going to take that to the next level?
Right. So we thought we need to take these plays in front of the rule makers. And we need to get the rule makers and the people who influence the rule makers to take this process seriously. Because we think that we need creative solutions to some problems that have been going on for a long time. So we started engaging in legislative theater, the formula for which we call watch, act, vote. Watch the plays made by real people facing the problems, act out your ideas on stage and generate new alternatives, and then turn those ideas into policy proposals with policy advisors from groups like the Vera Institute of Justice and the New York Civil Liberties Union and the Bronx Defenders, and then vote on those ideas with city council members and federal agencies and the New York State Attorney General's office, all those folks who have participated in our legislative theater events over the last few years.
I think we should tell everybody about some of the change that we've made with legislative theater.
Exactly. So legislative theater, to be honest, we are still figuring out exactly how much power it can have in New York City and across the country. And exactly how we can use it. But one example, well, a lot of examples, actors, audience members have followed up, have started to vote for the first time, have started to call their council members for the first time, have started to attend hearings for the first time, so civic engagement. But more than that, we're interested in concrete creative civic change, right? So Carlos Menchaca right here, big fan of legislative theater. He also was a theater major in college. That's how you have to get the legislators in. And 2014, he came to our festival, and he saw a play by a young trans woman who was a victim of domestic violence. The police came to her door, asked for her ID. The gender on her ID did not match her gender, and they took that as a cause to search her apartment. They found syringes in her apartment that she was using for hormones, and they arrested her, calling it drugs. The audience identified a problem. They knew from our advocacy fair that we hold before the event and the information we're sharing with them that Carlos Menchaca, who was there, is the chair on immigration and was proposing in spring 2014 the NYCID. And they said, the audience wrote that you should be able to write either gender on the NYCID or, even more radical and new to the council member, leave it blank, without any doctor's note or proof of surgery or anything, which was not available before that in New York City. And that became part of the bill. And that now affects thousands of New Yorkers, including lots of the folks that we work with. So we started to figure out, okay, in order to make this keep happening, we need to have all those important players in the room. And that's where we turned to Devin.
So I came to Theater of the Oppressed NYC about 2 years ago. I was right out of college, so bright-eyed. I was bushy-tailed. I was like, oh my God, like this is the organization I want to work with forever. I had a background in community organizing and performance, and it was these really personal stakes that I was seeing in the work. I wanted the work that I was doing to be propelling creative change, which I knew was so core and integral to TONYC's mission. And so I realized pretty quickly on that community engagement was playing out in a few different ways, but I wanted to see ways that we could make our work not only to the public fun and innovative, but also sustainable, accessible, and also irresistible. And so community engagement was happening with our troops. We were creating shows based on people's real experiences and showing those to the public. We were engaging with audiences who were engaging with these stories. They were giving their ideas. And then also, it was happening with the relationships that we were building with the Legislative Theater Festival. Like you're saying, we're working with organizations as policy advisors, we're working with city agencies, and we're also engaging organizations in our advocacy fairs. But it was my job to figure out how we were going to carry these relationships forward and how we were going to make them, you know, sustainable for the long run in all of the work that we're doing, to make sure that our shows weren't just in a bubble, right? We didn't want our performances to just be a one-off. We wanted them to be engaging with the movements and the campaigns that were happening throughout New York City. And so it was with the 2016 Legislative Theater Festival, where we were working with the Fortune Society and the Ali Forney Center, working with LGBTQ homeless youth, and then also formerly incarcerated veterans who had experiences of homelessness. And so we were working with really cool organizations like Vocal New York, like Picture the Homeless, like NYCLU. They were all joining us and giving their kind of expertise behind the policy issues, helping with the context, giving context not only to the actors, but to the audience members who were there, and giving their input about movements and campaigns that were being driven. And this was how we could loop ourselves in by putting in that kind of creative and innovative way of community organizing.
So how did we do that?
So we did that with an initiative that we're calling Tune In and Turn Out, right? So tuning in, so being good listeners and listening to what's happening around us, because we need to be responsive to movements, we need to be responsive to campaigns, we need to be responsive to the activism that's happening. We're not inventing this. None of us are inventing this, because this work is already being done on the ground. And then turning out our folks, such as like this, for rallies, for hearings, for mobilizations, and giving a way to creatively storytell and to humanize these issues that you're seeing every single day around you.
So yeah, what are a few examples?
So one really cool example, so Riders Alliance, I don't know if you've heard of that organization, they reached out to us and they were like, we are having a hearing about the Fair Fares campaign at City Hall. We want to loop you in. So Fair Fares aims to provide half-price transit for low-income New Yorkers. How many of y'all were late because of the MTA today? Yeah? Yeah, and how many of you think you're also paying a little bit too much for unreliable transit? Yeah? Yeah, okay, same. This is something that we can all get behind. And so we sent Concrete Justice, this is Maji from Concrete Justice, to this rally on the steps of City Hall. And she was there to share a scene about choosing between groceries or her Metro card. And so in turn, this was able to get them a ton of really exciting press. It was able to give us a little bit of a boost in that it was showing other organizations that this is a creative way to organize. And in turn, this became a mutual relationship. And really, it became our goal to create these mutually supportive ecosystems with organizations who are doing the work on the ground and making sure that our work is also on the ground.
Organizations that need a little bit more fun.
Right, exactly. And so we continued doing this work with organizations like Just Leadership USA and the Close Rikers campaign, with Vocal New York, with Picture the Homeless, and really just making sure that all of our work is looped into each other, and making sure that organizing is not only, you know, doing the work, but also accessible and fun. Because really, we're not going to make change if we don't have the three magic ingredients. Write this down, everybody. It's fun. I'm sure you guessed that, right? Community voices and civic engagement. Those are the three things that you really, really need to move forward. And so this is, a photo of one of our advocacy fairs before the Legislative Theater Festival, where we were able to mobilize over 50 organizations working around issues of immigration, working around issues of cultural equity and access for low-income New Yorkers, working around issues of restorative justice and youth who have been involved with the justice system. And that was a huge thing for us. And we're not going to stop now. And so we want to leave you with, we're not just watching,
We're not just acting.
We're mobilizing
And making
we're making change.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I want to ask Afia, Devin, Katie, and Jeff to join us so you can thank them again for their incredible presentations. And I want to encourage all of us. To to check out Phil TV. That's what you can find all the Phil talks. I think that, do we have time for one reflection? So I'm going to ask you one quick reflection out of listening to each other, something that picked you up. Afia, let's begin with you.
Well, I love the idea of fun, right? And how we can incorporate people's stories in a way that builds power, builds people collectively, and also allows them to challenge themselves and break through barriers. And hearing about the elected officials who had to come into that space and being vulnerable in that space, I think can be a powerful way.
I'm inspired by all of this, and we in journalism, as I said before, tend to be isolated. We tend to think we're apart and above. And what's so inspiring about this is how you are in your communities, giving voice to those communities. And I wish the journalists could learn a lot of lessons from all of you.
Devin.
First off, I'm like, CVH, why aren't we working together more? I'm like, this is a partnership right here. And another thing I think that Jeff said was really the power of listening, right? A lot of us are bad listeners, and really if we're not taking the time to listen, and if we're not taking the time to really put our ear to the ground that, where all the work is being done, then we're not going to get anywhere. So I think that's really crucial. Thank you for that.
And Katie, we'll close with you.
Yeah, I mean, we got to have a sneak preview of Afia's talk yesterday at the rehearsal, and then we kept talking about base building as a contact sport, as kind of an amazing articulation of something that, and then seeing how that plays out and how that's impacted, people. I think that I'm going to keep that and learn from it in terms of what we're trying to do too.
Okay, everyone. Thank you so much again. Thank you for our presenters. And have lots of contact sport today.
Thank you so much again for a wonderful panel. I think that was a wonderful ending to this first part of this meeting. I felt sort of taken on a journey, if you will, from sort of affirming our own sort of community, the PNY community, under Phil's loving leadership, to then having this moment of making it real. Jeff, you are so right about listening and not being isolated. That's a good word for all of us as philanthropoids to absorb. I think I was so inspired. I think thinking of what Gareth said, think comprehensively, even if you're funding specifically and narrowly. You can do that one issue, but you have to think broadly about moving change. So it's all very inspiring. Thank you so much to the panelists. I'm here to announce a break. Yes, all that. You're clapping about the panels, not the break. But you have 30 minutes. Do we have 30 minutes? I'm confirming that time, or is it 25? 11:15, closer to 20, 11:15. Coffee, etc. is outside. Stretch your legs. If you don't want to, turn to someone next to you and make a new friend. Thank you.
have to get quiet just yet, but I love that I can command the audience that way. I love that. But I do need you to make your way to your seats, please. And if you're just coming in, come on up to the front. Don't be afraid. This is not a lecture class. Come on up. I still have 1 minute and 2 seconds. And so do you. And so do you. Wow. I didn't know how cool this was up here. Come on in, take your time. You still have 45 seconds. We will start on time, however. I'll do a little advance warning. Did everyone get their card for your question? Yes. All right, excellent. I know. All right. Hello, and welcome back to the 38th annual meeting of Philanthropy New York. My name is Yvonne Moore, and I am the Principal Philanthropic Advisor at Moore Philanthropy and the Vice Chair of the Board at Philanthropy New York. And it's my honor to introduce and welcome the panelists for our final portion of our program. We've already heard many ideas about how to increase and deepen public participation in our democratic process, and we're going to hear even more ideas over the next hour. But today is not the end of the conversation for Philanthropy New York. As we have with previous annual meetings, we hope today will simply be a jumping off point for additional programming on this subject over the course of the next year and beyond. Several members have already suggested follow-up discussions, including a deeper examination of the legislation passed by the New York State Assembly, which ironically hasn't yet been taken up in the Senate, that would bring early voting, automatic registration, and electronic poll books to New York State. Philanthropy is also looking at how it is and how it could support efforts to ensure the quality of the 2020 census, the quality and the reach of the 2020 census. We talked a little bit about this morning about how participation actually happens. And so I hope that we will actually embrace some of that feedback that was given to the fact that participation can't take place right before an election. It needs to be ongoing and happening all the time. And finally, how funders are investing in local journalism to give way to communities telling their own stories. As members of Philanthropy New York, we welcome your ideas about the issues we should be exploring, and I personally encourage you to consider taking up an active part and become a member of a committee or a network. Before I introduce our final panel, The Power of Participation, a few programming notes. Following this panel, our president, Ronna Brown, will return to the stage and bring us to a formal close. During the final conversation, we would like to give you an opportunity to ask questions. However, to keep it manageable, we'll be taking your questions on index cards. If you haven't gotten a card, looks like Catherine's telling me that everybody's got a card. If you don't have one, just raise your hand and they'll make sure that you get it. We'll start collecting those cards about 30, we've got some hands up over here. We'll start collecting those cards about 30 minutes into the conversation. Raise your hands high, and they'll make sure you get a card. She's on her way back in with some cards. We'll start collecting those about 30 minutes into the conversation. Now, I'm going to give you a suggestion. You can take it if you want to. I suggest you keep it short and legible. Okay? Don't get mad if your question is not asked and no one could read your penmanship. And also take a hint from the size of the card. Question. Now, get your hand up there, back with the cards. Hold your hand up really, really high for us. Excellent. Now, fun stuff. I'm very truly honored to welcome our distinguished panel to the stage. You all can begin making your way on up, Radhika. That's fine. I know they say I'm bossy. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yes, yes. First, we welcome Amy Goodman. Amy is the host and executive producer of Democracy Now! the global daily independent news program airing on over 1,400 public television stations and radio stations worldwide. She became the news herself this past year with her extraordinary on-site coverage at Standing Rock. She is the winner of numerous awards and recognitions in journalism and is the author of 6 New York Times bestsellers, the latest being Democracy Now!, 20 years covering the movements changing America. Next to Amy is Chris Hayes. Chris is the Emmy Award-winning host of All In with Chris Hayes on MSNBC, an editor-at-large at The Nation, and author of the 2012 book Twilight of the Elite, America After Meritocracy. His new book, A Colony in a Nation, released in March, puts forth that while America likes to tell itself that it inhabits a post-racial world, every empirical measure, which we love, every empirical measure, including wealth, unemployment, incarceration, and school segregation, reveals that racial inequality in our country hasn't improved since 1968. And last but by no means least, our panel moderator is Radhika Jones. Radhika is the editorial director of books at the New York Times and a former deputy director at Time Magazine, where she was charged with editing 2 of the publication's most famous issues, Person of the Year and Time 100's Most Influential People. Radhika, after our thanks, I'll turn it over to you. Please join me once again in welcoming our esteemed panel.
Good morning. Is the mic is working. I think the mic is working. Okay, great. We have a lot to discuss, and we wanted to start by giving our panelists a chance to kind of let you know a little bit about where they're coming from on these issues of democracy building and civic engagement. So, in terms of the themes of the day, voting access, the abilities and opportunities for people to engage in the democratic process, and significantly for all of us on this stage, I think that the issues around the quality of information that people are receiving that can help them along the path to that participation. Chris, do you want to talk a little bit about sort of what's primary in your mind when you think about these issues?
Sure. Yeah, I think so. I think there's a few major trends that are happening that are the sort of structural landscape of civic participation, democracy building. One, I would say, and in some ways the most elemental, is just the structural polarization of the country. The polarization is there's a big debate about the degree to which it's cause and effect, right? Is it that elites are polarized and they send signals to voters to be polarized? Is it that it's actually a genuine sort of self-sorting that's happening? There's interesting data in both directions about the degree to which that kind of polarization is a thing that's happening organically on the ground and how much it's being sort of led from above. But as a sort of structural fact about American politics, it's a really key and important one. American politics, at some level, I would say that multi-ethnic and pluralist democratic politics are always tribal to a certain extent, but I think American politics are growing more and more so in ways that are worrying and probably disruptive in a lot of ways. So that's one sort of huge factor that you encounter at all different levels. That relates to a second factor, which is to the extent that that polarization is happening, and it's happening in these very, very specific demographic terms, you've created a whole set of perverse incentives around participation. The whole idea of a secret ballot box, right, is that you don't know whether the person whose door you knock on is who they're going to vote for and what their politics are. But the nature of American political coalitions and also data and technology means that you can basically predict pretty well if you give someone some data about who that person's going to vote for, which of the two major coalitions they associate with. And because of that, it then produces the incentives to take steps to disempower the other group. And I think this has largely been, at the risk of sounding partisan, asymmetrical. I think that the Republicans and conservatives have largely recognized that they have an opportunity, often driven by by race, to essentially erect bars to democratic participation, whether through gerrymandering. Everyone should look at that North Carolina map, which is insane. They keep getting struck down, North Carolina and Texas, et cetera, or through voter IDs, or other just sort of what we might call the kind of a sort of avalanche of hassle that you can put small obstacles in people's way. I mean, I had the experience here in New York City of just trying to vote. I thought I was going to be away for election day, and then I wasn't, and I had to go through like 100 different steps to like get the absentee ballot and then maybe cancel it and go vote. And New York, by the way, is a just disaster, as all of you know. It's an embarrassment. It is, and I think actually New York is a great counterexample to a vision of this that's entirely partisan. New York is obviously a solidly blue state. New York City politics are solidly within the power of the Democratic Party, and yet there's an interest on the behalf of incumbent powers to not have a lot of people vote. The whole system is designed to create very low turnout elections in which organized interests can have high leverage in the turnout in those elections. And this has been produced by a lot of institutions that we normally think of, or I normally think of, as sort of being associated with more enfranchisement, particularly public unions that have an interest in keeping turnout low because it allows them greater leverage. So it's not purely it's not purely partisan, but it is in some ways the sophistication by which people can employ these tools of suppression and hassle is an outgrowth of the lines around polarization that have grown so stark, right? So if every voter you can tell in the dark by their address, by their education level, by their race, by their demographic information, like which coalition they're in, you could do all kinds of things to try to create structural barriers for the other group and enhance your own. And we've seen this put to use. The third factor, I would say, is what I would call the nationalization of American politics, which I think is a really important and fascinating phenomenon and an under-recognized one. The nationalization of American politics is, I think, largely born out of the hollowing out of local media. The entire business model for huge swaths, it's a little like an ecosystem that had an invasive species come and just like take out a huge middle part of the ecosystem, right? So the invasive species in this case being essentially the sort of the internet and Craigslist and the collapse of local advertising revenue, and it just came and it just ate through an entire part of the media ecosystem, which was essentially local coverage, built frankly off local newspapers that had things like state reporters in Capitol Hill and things like that. That's been largely eviscerated. And it's had two effects, I think. One is that the information that people have access to about local government has gotten very poor. There are just fewer reporters. This is demonstrated empirically. There's all sorts of people who've done work on this. There are fewer state house reporters. There are fewer city hall reporters. There are fewer people going to school board meetings. All of the sort of basics of government reporting at the local level has just been totally eviscerated in the last 20 years. But I think another effect of that is that what you are seeing is because political media is increasingly national, it's creating this sort of reverb effect where, as opposed to, it used to be the case that, Texas politics were different in interesting ways than American politics. And actually, what's happening in Texas is a perfect example. Texas, for a very long time, obviously, it's a very Republican state. Well, it was a very Democratic state, very Republican state, very conservative. But because of the distinct nature of Texas politics, actually was did not have a sort of virulent anti-immigrant politics. And that's because of the legacy of you've got ninth generation Mexican Americans in Texas. You've got a fairly large caucus of Hispanic legislators in the Republican Party in Texas. So all of the sort of polarized demographic tribalism of American politics on this issue had largely not reached Texas. And in fact, this was a huge problem for Rick Perry when he ran in 2012, in which he had signed a bill that allowed undocumented students in Texas to pay in-state tuition, a sort of micro dream act. He got absolutely destroyed by it by Mitt Romney, actually, we should note, who beat him over the head with it. That's all changing now in Texas. This latest legislative session in Texas, all of the kind of nastiness of the national politics on immigration, particularly among the right, has now been imported back into a state that has more experience directly on the ground with this than the folks in Iowa or New Hampshire where these issues are playing very well. It's a very bizarre thing. So here you have a state that has organically experienced immigration and come to a set of policies that, while to my mind aren't ideal, are a kind of interesting, pragmatic crafting around what the actual exigencies are. And that is now being replaced with the most sort of like sloganeering, simple binaries of American political discourse about immigrants imported back into a place that actually knows better. And that to me is a perfect example of the ways in which the sort of politics of the country have been nationalized, right? So everything now sort of runs through the national political dialogue back into local places, which is sort of the opposite of how we fundamentally want a kind of federalist system to work, right? The whole idea of laboratories of the state, et cetera, and local governance is that, the people, what's the Dewey line? Like the man who wears the shoes knows where the hole is, right? Like the idea is that you want citizens on the ground, legislators on the ground to be encountering first person what their problems are, coming to solutions, and that's sort of working its way up. And in fact, it's happening the opposite now. So you've got this crazy nationalization of politics, and all of this is sort of run through the same polarization mechanism in all three of the sort of structural things I'm identifying. And I think it's creating tremendous dysfunctions. The last thing I'll say about participation is the weird byproduct of this from a participation standpoint and sort of the vibrancy of civil society is this kind of pendulum swinging of activism, right? So people only get activated when they feel like the other team is in power, right? So when the other team's in power, it's like I am now, and it's dangerous, I think, actually, in terms of a legitimacy question, right? Like the whole thing this all rests on, right, is the idea that there are nonviolent means of redressing grievance through representative politics, and that no one has a total hold on power when the other side is in power. That's like the basics of keeping a kind of liberal democracy together. Increasingly, people feel like they are fundamentally disenfranchised and out of power when the other side controls it. What you do see as a kind of benefit of that is a surge of civic engagement, and that's been largely salutary in a lot of ways. And I say this on both sides. I mean, like the Tea Party activism in 2010, like people get activated, they show up meetings, they talk to their congressmen, they contact them, but it only happens in the context when the pendulum is on the other side. And there's something I think kind of structurally dangerous about that.
Amy, activism seems like a good point for you to pick up on.
Well, I thought I would just tell a story to start off, talk about the standoff at Standing Rock and how important it is to have a media that provides a forum for people to speak for themselves. I mean, whether we're talking about a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandmother, a native elder from Standing Rock Sioux tribe in North Dakota, or an uncle in Afghanistan, to hear someone describing their own experience, there's nothing more powerful, framing their own story. I mean, you don't have to agree with it. How often do we even agree with our family members? But you begin to understand where they're coming from. And that understanding is the beginning of peace. I think the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, all too often, it's wielded as a weapon of war. And that's why I think we have to take the media back. I see the media as a huge kitchen table that stretches across the globe, that we all sit around and debate and discuss the most important issues of the day. War and peace, life and death. And anything less than that is a disservice to the servicemen and women of this country who can't have these debates on military bases. They rely on us in civilian society to have the discussions that lead to the decisions about whether they live or die, whether they're sent to kill or be killed. Anything less than that is a disservice to a democratic society. So Democracy Now! We started 21 years ago on 9 community radio stations. We're going to wrap up after it was an election year, the only election program and public broadcasting daily show then. President Clinton was reelected that year. We're going to wrap up the next day. And there was more demand for our show after the election than before, because we looked at the primaries as a way to look at what people were doing in their states, in their communities. At the time, most people didn't vote. I didn't think it was about apathy. I thought, well, what are they doing in their communities? How are they engaged? Let them describe what they're doing. And that, that provides a kind of excitement when you hear people, not the typical pundits, but people describing their own experiences. So that was 96, and 9 stations, and then we started on television the week of the September 11th attacks by chance as emergency broadcasting, because we were the closest national broadcast to Ground Zero. We broadcast out of an old firehouse near Ground Zero that became a media center. And once we started on TV, more and more stations took us, and now we're on these 1,400 stations, public television and radio. We just went on about 10 more PBS stations across the country as part of a native news channel. And this goes to our coverage of Standing Rock. But for those of you who are following this, you may know this, and I just came off of Democracy Now! Today. We do the show every morning, 8 to 9, and I was interviewing the 45th chairman of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, Dave Archambault, who most of you may have heard of, 45th chairman, like, you know, Donald Trump is the 45th president of the United States, at least for now. And this chapter of the struggle began April 1st, just over a year ago. The unofficial historian of the Standing Rock Sioux, LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, opened up her property along the Cannonball River in North Dakota. She's a descendant of Sitting Bull, to the resistance to the $3.8 billion Dakota Access Pipeline. They call it, the Native Americans, the Black Snake, that snakes its way from taking fracked oil from the Bakken oil fields of North Dakota through South Dakota, Indiana, Illinois, and will hook up with a pipeline to the Gulf of Mexico. And the Native Americans said no. Now, they weren't alone. I mean, the people of Bismarck, North Dakota said no, and the people of Mandan, North Dakota, they didn't want it either. The difference for the Native Americans is they weren't so lucky. Energy Transfer Partners, which owns the Dakota Access Pipeline, decided to place it right near their reservation. And this resistance just kept growing. First tens of people, then hundreds, then thousands. They had to open up more resistance camps. There was the Red Warrior Camp and others. It was the largest unification of Native American tribes we have seen in this country in decades, from Latin America, from the United States, the First Nations from Canada. And this is growing through when? 2016, the election year. In the time of the general elections, the journalists who moderated the debates on television, they never asked a question about climate change, let alone the Dakota Access Pipeline. Not a question. Yet on the ground in this country, the level of resistance that was building, not only among Native Americans, but also their non-Native allies, saying we have to find a way to develop a sustainable economy for this planet. It can't be based on fossil fuels. The Native Americans didn't see themselves as just doing this for themselves. They didn't see themselves as protesters, but water protectors. You know, the pipeline would go under the Missouri River, the longest river in North America, and they felt that it endangered 17 million people downstream. So they resisted. And we went Labor Day weekend. Even that was late. We were covering it before, but weren't on the ground until that weekend. And what we saw was just astounding. I mean, you would see people marching down these back prairie roads of North Dakota, hundreds of people led by Native elders, often women. They'd start with a water ceremony. They'd have glasses of water. And then they would confront a fully militarized sheriff's department. I mean, they had MRAPs, they had tanks, they had rubber bullets, they had automatic weapons. They would hold these glasses of water, the Native Americans, and they would say, this is for you, not just for us. This is for your children, not just ours. Now, you've seen this image of the militarized police departments because of Ferguson. And, you know, you have these local police departments. This is recycling in America today. You take the military hardware from Afghanistan and Iraq, and you give it to the police departments of the United States. And it's no surprise they view everyone around them, even if they're their neighbors, as the enemy when you're looking, you know, through the crosshairs. We had Norm Stamper on a little while ago, the former police chief of Seattle, who was driven out after the Battle of Seattle, you know, all the major protests against the World Trade Organization in 1999. I mean, his police department hit the protesters back in 1999. High school kids, librarians, teachers, doctors, nurses, farmers from around the world with so much tear gas they had to go to other states to get more. And we just had Norm Stemper, and he was ousted afterwards, as he should have been. But he said that was the worst mistake of his life, what he did. He said, when we had that much military and paramilitary equipment, he said, we just forgot. These are our kids. Many high schoolers were arrested. These are environmentalists, the nurses, the doctors. These are our community. And we did see them as the enemy, he said. And we're seeing the same thing play out in these major actions that are taking place. So we covered the protests. And then on Saturday of Labor Day weekend, we're following some Native Americans who were going to plant their tribal flags in an area they had said was their sacred burial ground. A judge had said, if you say it's sacred, prove it to me. Show me a map where the burial mounds are. And they made a map. This is right before Labor Day weekend. And then the judge gave it to the Dakota Access Pipeline. And when the Native Americans came up on this property, they saw the bulldozers operating at full tilt. They were shocked. They thought it was a holiday. They weren't going to be doing it. But also, it was the very property they designated. And the bulldozers had been way down the road. And they felt they had taken this map that they had provided and leapfrogged forward and actually were destroying what they designated so that when the judge would rule the next week, it would, the facts would change on the ground. It would be a moot point. So they were furious. And they came up on the property, kids, women, men, elders, boys, soon hundreds of people, and they were demanding the bulldozers move back. These are incredibly brave acts to see a woman holding the hand of a child, because these are massive machines, these bulldozers, churning the earth. But they did succeed in pushing them back. And then the Dakota Access Pipeline guards unleashed attack dogs on the Native Americans. Dogs. And they were biting the Native Americans. You'd even see the dogs sometimes pull back, and they'd throw them into the crowd. They'd bite their way out. We were interviewing people who were bitten, who were bleeding. We showed a video of a dog with its mouth and nose dripping with blood. Ultimately that day, the people, bloodied, beaten, maced, bitten, did succeed in pushing everyone back, and the guards would leave in their pickup trucks. But they had prevailed. We took this video, we posted it online that night on Facebook, and within 24, 48 hours, there was something like 14 million views. Even for the corporate media, this was a massive response, and it really showed them, if you ask them, why don't you cover these issues? Raise it once in a debate. And they would say, well, we give the people what they want. If that's not the kind of thing they're interested in. And this just shows the lie. That number was big for anyone. So we went back to New York, and we continued to cover this. And the judge was going to rule the following Friday. On Thursday, Governor Dalrymple, the governor of North Dakota at the time, called out the National Guard. It didn't look good for the tribe. The judge would be ruling the next day, that Friday. And they also quietly issued an arrest warrant for me. Now, I didn't know this at the time. So Friday we did our show, and then we headed up to Canada. I wasn't fleeing, but it was the Toronto International Film Festival, and they were doing a film on I.F. Stone, the great muckraking journalist who taught students, if you're going to remember 2 words, remember governments lie. If you can remember 3 words, remember all governments lie. So, and then they were showing independent media today. So it was showing Democracy Now!, Matt Taibbi at Rolling Stone. So Matt came up to the film festival. And we spoke that night, and the next day at University of Toronto. And in the middle of my talk, I looked down, and I had just gotten a text that said, you're under arrest. So I thought this was like spam or something. It said, like, there's an arrest warrant out for you. But then I did see it was a North Dakota number. And so I thought, OK, I'm in trouble because I'm in Canada. You don't get arrested immediately. But if you deal with police, FBI, or border guards, and the arrest warrant's in the system, then they'll take you. So I have to get back over the border. So in the middle of the talk, I just said, could someone call me a cab, please? And I raced to the airport, came back. I didn't take the arrest warrant personally because I thought it was a warning to all journalists, do not come to North Dakota. And I thought it was particularly critical to fight this for young journalists who don't have the resources or the institutional support to end up in jail when they try to cover one of these epic struggles of our lifetime. And so, I thought I'd call their bluff. They had no reason to call for my arrest. So we flew back to North Dakota a few weeks later in October. And as we landed on that Friday in October, the prosecutor announced he was dropping the charges against me, but he would bring more serious charges of riot, and I could face a year in jail. So, I mean, I'm a one-woman riot? What was he possibly talking about? So I called my North Dakota lawyer, not that I had one before, and I said, well, what's going to happen here? And so he said, you're going to be arraigned on Monday at 1:30, which gave us 2.5 days to cover the protests, which we did. And I said, well, what happens? Does anyone intervene before this arraignment? He said, no, it's absolutely automatic. The judge just rubber stamps it. Then they use their discretion after the arraignment. I said, no, that's what separates judges from us mere mortals. He has to decide to sign off on this. He said, it doesn't work like that. But we put out a press release and we named the judge and said he would be making this decision about whether I would be arraigned, whether these charges would stand. We covered the protests over the weekend. On Monday morning, the show must go on, so we brought up a broadcast truck from Minneapolis. We broadcast in Mandan in front of the courthouse and the jail so that I could turn myself in afterwards. So the backdrop was the courthouse, the jail, and the 10 Commandments in between. And it was 7 a.m. North Dakota time, and I interviewed Dave Archambault, the chairman of the tribe, said, have you ever been arrested? He said yes. It was his first arrest a few months before for protesting the pipeline. He had gotten low-level misdemeanor, and I said, what happened? He said, I strip searched, put in an orange jumpsuit, and I was jailed. I asked Dr. Sarah Jumping Eagle, the pediatrician of the tribe, who cares about the children's health. She had been one of the first to be arrested. What happened? Strip searched, orange jumpsuit, and jailed. I mean, the humiliation of these people, it's just astounding. How much can they take? At the airport one time in Bismarck, I bumped into a guy who said, don't think I don't know who you are. I said, oh, well, who are you? And he said, I'm one of the guards that was on the site that day. And I said, did you unleash the attack dogs? And he said, no. We didn't know that was going to happen. Dakota Access Pipeline had hired several different security guards at companies. We were as surprised as anyone. He said, you don't think I get it? We sick dogs on them after we've massacred them for hundreds of years. He said, I know why they're angry at us. You know, you never assume a person's position based on the position that they have. And to bring out all of these voices is absolutely critical. We interviewed on the Day of the Dogs, Winona LaDuke of the White Earth Reservation, northern Minnesota. She said, Governor Dalrymple, you are not George Wallace. This is not Alabama 1965. We are through. President Obama was in Asia the week of, right after Labor Day, before the judge ruled against the tribe. And he was asked at a democracy forum for young students, Asian students from around the region who'd come to Laos, the first trip of President Obama to Laos, teaching them about democracy. The young woman at the end raised her hand from Malaysia and she says, Governor, President Obama, what about the Dakota Access Pipeline? She had asked a question of President Obama that no journalist had publicly asked President Obama in this entire year. And he held forth, was eloquent about the oppression of Native Americans, but then when it came to DAPL, he said, I'd have to get back to my team. He came back, he reportedly saw the video of the dogs, and when the judge ruled against the tribe that Friday after Labor Day, when we had gone to Canada, a few minutes later, an unprecedented 3-agency letter was released, Justice Department, Army Corps of Engineers, and Interior, saying they would slow down on the pipeline and really see if Native Americans had the proper input and if there was an environmental impact statement. So back to that day of being arraigned, after the show, more and more Native Americans came to where we were broadcasting across the street from the courthouse to perform ceremonies, show solidarity. Riot police were lining up. It was getting extremely serious. And just as I was about to go across the street for my arraignment, I got a call from North Dakota Public Radio. I mean, everyone was now covering this, but he said, you know, he knew all the players, been there for decades, said the judge will not sign off. And this was a first, will not sign off on the charges. You're not going to be arraigned. And it was not only me. The Native Americans who faced felonies and misdemeanors that day, a number of them had their charges dropped. And this just shows, I mean, the Times was covering it, the Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, the homepage of BBC, a journalist is being arraigned. Vogue magazine was covering this. When the media spotlight is shining in the right direction, what a difference it can make. I'm all for reality television, not the kind that President Trump stars in, but the kind that actually shows the reality of people's lives on the ground, the dignity of providing a forum for people to speak for themselves. That was October. December 5th, President Obama, they issued another 3-agency letter. They were going to reroute the pipeline or slow it down further. And then President Trump took office, and one of his first acts in office was to grant the permit to drill under the Missouri River and to move forward not only on DAPL, the Dakota Access Pipeline, but also, he said, on Keystone XL. And last week, speaking before a rally, he said, "I did it with my eyes closed." And that's what we played for Chairman Archambault today to say, what did you think of that? Now, interestingly, the end of this story, the mass protests that have happened along the way, the People's Climate March in Washington on April 29th, the week before the March for Science, all around climate change, many Native Americans involved with this, the level of engagement now of the Native American community and many others. In any place, like when I asked you if you knew about this story, any place I go, it is astounding how many people know about the standoff. And it is not because of the corporate media. And this is very, very important. Indigenous media first and foremost, and independent media, not brought to you by the oil companies when we cover climate change, not brought to you by the weapons manufacturers when we cover war and peace, not brought to you by the insurance industry and big pharma when we cover healthcare, but independently brought to you by listeners, viewers, and readers who are hungry for independent views. So last week, although the pipeline has been built, and according to Energy Transfer Partners, the oil is flowing, Judge Boasberg, who ruled against the tribe in September, just ruled that he will take up the case of the pipeline, decide whether or not, based on hearings next week of both sides, Native Americans have had the proper impact, whether when Trump made this decision, a proper environmental impact statement had been done, and will decide whether to shut it down. Meanwhile, the Standing Rock Sioux are starting to build solar and wind farms right next to the pipeline to show what an alternative can look like. And it has been an education to people in this country and around the world. Now media knows no borders. It is truly global. And people are intensely interested in a way I have not seen before, because this involves all of us. Taking on the issue of climate change involves the fate of the planet. And no matter what our current administration says about climate change, the reason there's this universal response from conservative governments to progressive ones around the world is obviously they know the facts. They know the truth about climate change.
So let's talk about the media environment, because there are a lot of overlaying complications, and some of the points that you both raised. Chris, you talked about the death of local reporting, which contributes to the atmosphere that we live in, of distrust for the national media. And
Totally.
it's very much because, there's no more local paper reporter at the ball game or at the court hearing. People aren't seeing reporters doing their jobs day to day and interacting with the community the way they used to. So it plays in, the death of local reporting plays into that general distrust of the media as an institution. At the same time, you have this impulse of the media to be a platform for individual stories. But that's playing into an incredibly polarized media environment in which literally the news is different depending on which channel you watch, or importantly, which social media feeds you're watching. And I think the lack of trust in institutional media and the rise of social media and the kind of increase in the polarization of social media, where you have your feed, you have your Facebook friends, you have your bubble, and you're hearing what you think is news. And on the other side of the political divide, the news is completely different. How in that climate, with all of these different forces pulling at us and pulling at our attention, are there ways of improving, very simply, the way that Americans are informed?
I mean, I don't know. I don't mean to be pessimistic. I think that, I mean, I guess here's one thing I would say. Like, we tend to talk about some golden age of media, which was really like anomalous, right? So the kind of idea of the 3 broadcast networks and big papers was the product of a bunch of market forces in terms of consolidation and monopoly that allowed there to be, this huge audiences on very limited number of outlets, right? My favorite example of this is that Tiny Tim's wedding on The Tonight Show had 45 million viewers. Like, what? 45 million people watch Tiny Tim get married at 11:30 at night? Yeah, and when you say, well, why? It's like, because there was nothing else on. There's like 3, So, but there was a degree to which the fact that you had this very small number of outlets meant that the sort of, to Amy's point about the kitchen table, right? Like, the kitchen table was, in some senses, particularly at the national level, like it was very clearly defined, right? Like, everyone's interacting through this same set of mediated experiences. And, there's a way to glorify that, which is that I think it produced a kind of like national conversation in a way, but also it was terrible in a lot of ways because the editorial decisions had incredible amounts of power for huge amounts of communities that were not represented or reflected at all in the coverage in the newsrooms, et cetera. So there's this trade-off that's happening, right? So the death of that, the sort of proliferation of different avenues, creates this sort of extremely both ecstatic and exuberant set of new forms and also more balkanization. I think that the one thing I think to focus on when you think about this is how these enterprises are structured. So I think Democracy Now! Is a great example where, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but Democracy Now! is creating a media that people contribute to because of the totality of it, which is to say, like, you guys are not like getting up every morning and be like, oh, we had this many views yesterday, we have to deal with this many views today. There's a sort of capital buy-in, like in the reputational capital of the product, of the, not the product, but of the experience of what it's doing, right? And the sort of really deleterious set of incentives that now expands across all media and even small independent media is this sort of attentional incentive, which is clicks, views, ratings. And that's true for me, right? Because I have to, every day at 4:15, there's a spreadsheet that gets mailed out to my entire company saying what we did by quarter hours across all 4 networks, right? So I get a grade every day in 15-minute increments for my work the previous day that everyone sees every day.
Wow.
And that number is the most important thing in my performance. So that is, when you talk about the corporate media, like that's literally 1,000 times more important than advertisers. I literally have no idea who my advertisers are. I've never talked to them. I have no idea. What I do know is how the first block performed yesterday. What grabbed people's attention. Like I literally have no idea who advertised on my show, but I do know what rated and what didn't. And I do know that if we did that block on Syria and it dipped 50,000 viewers, like, right? So now think about that, right? Those incentives have now cascaded downward, right? Because if you're running a YouTube channel as an independent content producer, you now are seeing that every day. You know what gets clicks and what doesn't. And I have watched those sets of incentives shape the contours of even independent media, because people are, the metrics are incredibly close to people. And so there is this incentive to sort of get people's attention. When we think about, when we think about tabloid media, right? Tabloid is this pejorative term. All it refers to is a format, right? It's not the broadsheet, it's the tabloid. And what we think about tabloid is, why is tabloid media tabloid? Why is tabloid media in the UK tabloid? Because it's competitive, right? Why are supermarket checkout counter magazines so salacious? Because they are competitive, because there are 5 of them and each of them is trying to get your attention. So there's a relationship between this kind of sense of market competition and all of the incentives that we called salacious and tabloid, right? So what a huge part of the project is to erect robust structures. Democracy Now! Is a great example of them. Local NPR is also a great example, that are insulated. It's not just from advertisers, right? But you can get rid of advertisers and still be in this tabloid mode because you still need to get clicks for the video that you put up on YouTube. The key thing is to get media models at every level, national level, local level. And the problem is it's harder to sustain at the local level, right? So Democracy Now! Has this huge global reach, the pool of people to which it can talk to. But if you want to do that for Boise, right? Like you've got a smaller amount of people in Boise that are going to give you contributions to buy into this project. But that's really, to me, the challenge is produce media models that are not live or die by attention day after day, that they're bought into as an enduring project that's going to make editorial decisions that some days you might click over to and be like, I'm not interested in reading about that. But they have the latitude to do that because the project as a whole is a project that people have bought into.
What do you do about people who just refuse to engage at all? I mean, part of the lesson of the Tiny Tim viewership is not just that there was nothing else on, but there was little else to do. And you know, something that I've thought a lot about in the various media institutions where I've worked is our competition. You know, it's not just those other media organizations. It's Candy Crush on your iPhone. It's, you know, it's your Instagram feed. I mean, there are literally so many things that can take away people's attention, particularly at a time where politics, wherever you fall, can feel demoralizing, depressing, stagnant, you know, harmful at worst. What do you think, Amy?
I mean, I don't think we have the problem of people not being engaged now. Even if the politics are so difficult, I think there is a level of heightened attention now like we have never seen before. And people are intensely interested. And it's trying to go beyond, and I know Chris does this too, go beyond the pundits you get on television who know so little about so much, explaining the world to us and getting it so wrong. Mm-hmm. I mean, to me, it is not a contradiction. Oh, you get on a local voice and no one's going to listen, but it's sort of good for them. I wish they would. It's nothing like that. I mean, give this example. The networks thought, no, people wouldn't be interested in climate change, so we're not going to present this kind of information. And the interest is intense. And people are getting their information all different ways. You know, Democracy Now!, just because of necessity is the mother of invention. From the beginning, we were 21 years ago online because it's the way we sent the radio. They didn't have the word podcast then, but the way we had to send everything for free. And then we perfected a way to send broadcast quality video through the internet. So when the networks are paying millions to Saddam Hussein in Iraq for use of the satellites, our colleague Jeremy Scahill and others were going into internet cafes using a special program that divided up our video broadcast into like 150 emails, go through a screen, and then we would piece it back together in New York. When the thugs brought down the satellites in Egypt at the time of Tahrir, and you saw Anderson Cooper in his hotel room looking a little like the old Democracy Now! On Skype, and the lower third was reporting from an undisclosed location. We had Sharif Abdel-Qaddus in Tahrir Square saying his name where he was and saying this is the safest place to be because our videographer with Sharif, who stayed there for those 18 days, went back, sent that 25-minute video of the people making this revolution, from the high school kids standing in the shadow of the state media building that had spewed lies for so many decades, to Hadef Souef, the great Egyptian writer who wrote Map of Love, who was standing next to two very pregnant women who said they won't give birth until Mubarak falls, to Nawal Saadawi, who ran for president, was exiled, was imprisoned, and was telling the young people even before this revolution, we will win, we will win. And you were meeting them all. What it looks like when a whole community, a country, engages in a revolution. Now, where that is today in Egypt is a whole other story. The crackdown this week, in particular, is intense. But those videos would be sent, we'd send them through the internet and broadcast them. And the hunger for all of this, I think the media paved the way for what we have today. For the President of the United States. I mean, we all have seen the studies from the Tyndall Report and others that Donald Trump, basically they rolled out the red carpet for any speech he gave, and they showed the empty podium longer, the networks, waiting for him to speak and then would show that whole speech than they ever played of anything Bernie Sanders said. And when you might say, well, people are more interested, and that's why we did it. I mean, you don't have to take it from independent journalists. Look at, right, the head of CBS said what we did was good for CBS and bad for America. But when you think about it, it was not only the rolling out the red carpet, the other candidates would have to go from state to state. He was, rolled into everyone's living room, uninterrupted. But then the kind of decisions the networks made not to broadcast the alternative. On March 15th, the third, I think it was Super Tuesday 3, you had 5 states, Illinois and Missouri among them. All of the candidates' speeches were run in full, as they should have been. I think Rubio was there then, Cruz, Clinton, Trump. They never even played Bernie Sanders' speech, not 1 second, or speculated where he was. In fact, he was speaking to the most people that night in Arizona, something like 8,000 people. So the next day, not that we planned to, but we said, okay, we'll do something that the networks, for some reason, have decided not to do, and play an excerpt of that speech. But when you look at what happened in that election, what happened with Bernie Sanders, who almost took the Democratic nomination with very little corporate media coverage, forget what your views are on these candidates. The decisions that were made to silence some and broadcast uninterrupted others determined what happened in this country and what we're dealing with today. And we need a media that is challenged, that is independent, and does not do that again.
I mean, I disagree in some ways. I don't disagree about the sort of quantity of coverage. Well, let me say this. In the broad sense, right, so the idea that like people will watch climate change coverage or DAPL, right, that is an outgrowth you discover on the other side of the hill that you go over because you're not prisoner to the incentives of attention. Like, Democracy Now! Covers DAPL not because they're like, I bet you there's a huge audience for this. It covers DAPL because like this is an important story to us, or covers Tahrir for that reason. Now you go and you do that from an editorial perspective, and then on the other side of the mountain you find like, hey, look at this. People really do care about this. This is so what ends up happening in the sort of the risk aversion that happens, right, around attention is you try to stick with what works. This becomes this sort of rain dance, right? So it's like, well, the Trump speech rated really well. And believe me, I mean, I know this as intimately as any human being on the planet. I mean that quite honestly. Like, these numbers are like, I can recall to you these numbers, right? So I know it's like, well, the Trump speech rated really well on Tuesday, and now it's Wednesday. And the competitor went to it and we didn't, and we got our butts kicked. So what are we going to do here? Now, again, all these decisions that are being made, they're not, I think Amy is right to point out that they're not necessarily the correct ones, and often they're not. In fact, there grows up this folk wisdom in media organizations about what people do and don't want that often gets very detached from the data. But the data is what's driving people's sense of risk aversion. So what you need is, ultimately what you need is create the platforms for media organizations that essentially are making editorial decisions first. I mean, that really is, to me, the key, right? Like what you want is to produce whatever the underlying funding structure is, okay? The Intercept's a great example right now, right? The Intercept has all this money from the guy that sold eBay, right? And they make editorial decisions about what they think is important. That's what they think. That's what they do.
But I'm saying I don't think that you have to make the decision, you're not going to have the eyeballs on this, but you think it's important. I actually think they go together, and you just, I mean.
Right, but you don't. I think that I know you believe that, and I think that's true largely. Mm-hmm. I'm saying that what I'm describing is sort of sociological sense, right? Is the institutional nature of how those incentives get calculated, right? So that may be true as an empirical matter, but people are still operating in frameworks where they're trying to chase this attention. And the sense of what does and doesn't work for that has a profound effect institutionally in how people chase that attention, right?
There are also.
I'm not saying they're right. I'm just saying that is that ultimately ends up being the kind of like North Star. And again, it is a cargo code. It gets it to my endless frustration. It produces folk wisdom, really, literally folk wisdom. Like literally, God, that doesn't rate. It's folk wisdom. It's like it's like your grandmother being like, oh, you catch a cold. It's like, well, I'm not gonna. Where's the data on that, right? It produces folk wisdom that's born of this sort of idea of get the eyeballs. And I genuinely think this. I think that the more competitive it's gotten, the more, in some ways, it drives towards risk aversion, right? So there's a relationship between the two, which is if it's a really competitive space and there's 9 different people, right? And as opposed to 2 or 3, there's this sort of idea of like, oh, well, they're going to do this thing. We need to sort of preemptively cut them off the path. You would think in some ways, right, it should be the opposite, right? At some level, you have this intuitive idea that competition shouldn't lead to clustering. It should lead to the opposite, right? What competition should produce is that people say, I'm going to carve out this distinct beat. I'm going to carve out this distinct identity. I'm going to carve out this distinct brand. But what ends up happening often, and just this is like a sociologically descriptive account, not a normative one, is that you get clustering out of this weird sort of insecurity, risk aversion that someone's going to beat you to this thing.
Mm-hmm. There also, we were talking before we got started about, you were telling the story of how difficult it is at the moment to cover the healthcare bill in the Senate. Mm-hmm. Because even though it's something that everybody has a vested interest in, there's literally nothing to say about it because it's being done in secret.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't give you daily developments, right? So the news is that a sixth of the economy is being restructured behind closed doors by 13 men, and not even those 13 men, because like yesterday, a few of them were on the record being like, I don't know what's in it, which like honestly I think is a lie. I think they're actually just not being truthful about it. I think but it's been a very effective mechanism to keep this thing under lock and key. Now the news is that it's secret, right? But it was hilarious to watch the 4 Democratic senators had a press conference yesterday where they talked about it, and they were talking about the Medicaid cuts, and a reporter said, somewhat rightly, well, how can you talk about the Medicaid cuts? You don't know what's in it. And I was like, well, this is the devious ingeniousness of this ridiculous strategy, which is that you can't criticize the thing because, like, well, you don't know there are Medicaid cuts.
But I mean, I don't think you just follow power and try to figure out what they're doing behind closed doors. There is a level of activism in this country, for example, around single payer, around Medicare for all. And this is the time, there's this window where people are deeply interested in healthcare. Mm-hmm. So you bring up these issues. Right. When was the last time you saw an advocate of single payer on television? And yet
they've been on my show.
Yeah, no, no, but I say recently.
How did that block? Did the block do well?
Figure out what power is doing between the Democrats and the Republicans. Have these discussions. When those kind of positions are put forward, most people actually agree. And what counts is the drumbeat coverage, right, the regular coverage of including people who expand the debate. I mean, when you're covering war, you don't just have a colonel on who feels that you should, put boots on the ground, and a general who says just bomb. What about the person who says, let's not attack at all? And this should be absolute level of debate in everything we do, and certainly on healthcare. Almost never. I mean, Chris is really an exception. Almost never. And I'm not talking Fox. I'm talking about MSNBC and CNN. Do they bring on a person who is an advocate of single payer? And sure, have them debate why 23 million people should lose their health care now. Have one of those people up against an Obamacare person. They don't even... it is absolutely critical that we bring out these views, and this is the perfect week to do that. The week when no one can figure out what's going on. Well, what about what people are organizing on the ground? California is nearing a single-payer bill being passed by both, houses of the legislature, and this is extremely important. And almost no coverage in the national media. But when you do, people watch, people care. This is what they're engaging in their communities.
That's true.
So we're with the philanthropic community today. And if we are at this moment of unprecedented engagement, or at least high levels of engagement. You know, I think it's worth thinking about in terms of practical steps even. America has this, I think, unique tradition in the world of expectation that if you have wealth and if you have means, you give back in some way. You practice engagement in that way. If you were advising a foundation here that has program areas that aren't explicitly focused on democracy building, but can maybe channel engagement, right? What would you say to that organization to help them make a difference?
I think it's really important to fund models for media that are not models for media and civic engagement that are not market dependent, and I say market dependent, and I don't mean like forget corporate, right? You can be independent and market dependent. Like I know a lot of independent media producers who are market dependent. They know exactly how many subscribers they have and how many YouTube views they got yesterday, right? So like creating models that produce debate, reported coverage, policy, particularly state house and local coverage, engagement around those issues that is insulated from all of these incentives is, I think, really crucial. And I think like it's so hard to scale and get, even in a city like New York. I mean, but there are so many places where people don't have what used to exist. Like what is my mayor doing? What is my governor doing? I mean, there's states that have one paper basically, like for the whole state. It's like, and maybe they have 2 state house reporters. So I also think it's really important to get past this kind of like, to get past that polarization and this sort of like, these sort of framing is that like, you got the situation where, oh great, like I'm getting my news about Oklahoma from a Vassar grad who went to Dalton. Like, awesome. I mean, no offense to Vassar grads that went to Dalton. I'm sure there's a few in the room, but like, you want like someone from Oklahoma reporting on the news about Oklahoma, and you want someone from the South Side of Chicago reporting on the South Side of Chicago, and et cetera, et cetera. And so building, I think that it really is like, this is a place where like there is a real need for building models, and not just like, writing a check, but actually building sustainable models that produce editorial decisions and newsrooms and investigative reporting and debate and events around stuff, sponsoring city council debates. Like, that's a crazy idea. Like, who's going to sponsor a city council debate? There should be city council debates. There should be debates between local prosecutors that are running for races, right? Like, all of this stuff that there used to be a lot more, frankly, institutional capacity to promote, is a lot of it's gone. And it's easy, I think, to lose sight of that in New York because it's hung on much better here than in other places with lower numbers of people, frankly, where the math doesn't work in the same way. But that to me is like just a hugely important thing that philanthropy can do is investing in models to produce that kind of reporting, civic engagement, discourse in this sort of entire sphere that has been largely eviscerated.
I mean, supporting independent media is just absolutely critical, local and independent media. I mean, we haven't even talked about citizen and non-citizen journalism, people picking up their cell phones. And I mean, the hunger for these kind of images and how they've changed everything, because you didn't just get then what the state, what the police, what the authorities were saying about an incident. You actually show this, and all too often the media in this country use the, those in power's version of a story. And now this has burst that right open. And at the same time, really empowered young people to get out there and really open their eyes and show the world what they're seeing as well. So it's really exciting at every single level, the idea that young people are looking at journalism and saying, God, I have seen this in my community. I don't see it reflected other places. I really want to document this. And, whether someone is a formal journalist or a citizen journalist or a non-citizen journalist, showing what's happening is really important. And supporting media outlets that are growing, that are new, that are there also, that, just bring out this whole other set of voices that I really do think are the majority of people in this country. It's not, you got to just hear the fringe. I think people who care about war and peace, about the growing inequality in this country, about racial injustice, about LGBTQ rights, about climate change are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media, which is why we have to take it back and why young people are so engaged right now.
I would also note, though, just in terms of the category of independent media, like that includes InfoWars. Like the independent media is a big thing that has people like, and citizen journalism. Like I've watched videos of people who are like citizen journalists going up to the Comet Pizzeria in Washington D.C. to crack the case. I mean, no, seriously, and like that is a very.
So you have to decide what you want to support.
That is a very successful enterprise that is giving voice to people that felt they didn't have a voice before.
Right.
As are white supremacist podcasts, which are popping up left and right, which the corporate media wouldn't run. Right? Like we should be clear about the totality of the terrain here that has been opened up is amazing in some ways, but also like super complicated when you get out into what is actually happening there. I mean, I have been somewhat obsessed recently with the growth of white supremacist media and alt-right media, and it is exploding. It is exploding on YouTube. There are people that are getting millions of views on YouTube, talking to teenagers basically who are essentially Nazis, and they have crossed through the filter, right? They have one of the biggest YouTube stars got in trouble because he was making anti-Semitic jokes. So it turns out this guy who'd been like getting 50 million views, like had like totally odious views about the Jews. But that terrain is really fascinating and rugged, and again, like any ecosystem has all these different kind of species in it, and the question about what to fund and how to find some funding things that have a sort of vision for the kind of civic good, I think is not that I don't think anyone in this room is going to be like signing up to fund the next alt-right podcast, but I don't know.
Well, so on that note, we have a few audience questions. How is the news media adapting to a paradigm of fake news and rapid distribution?
I mean, I don't know. I think one of the ironies of the age in this rapid distribution is that when you talk about independent producers, like so you were talking about the Facebook video, right? So there are these platforms that are total monopoly platforms that are producing the possibility of tremendous independent reach, right? So the video of Philando Castile's death, which was taken by his girlfriend, got millions of views because it was posted where? Facebook, right? So that was mediated through the largest media company in the world, which is a monopoly enterprise without question, right? Facebook and YouTube, as these platforms for independent channels of distribution, have unbelievable power. And there is I think people have not reconciled with that. What if, here's a fun thought experiment I think about all the time. Mark Zuckerberg decides to run for president, and every Facebook newsfeed in America gets lots of stuff about Mark Zuckerberg every day.
Right.
Why can that not happen?
Well, there has to be a whole discussion about, challenging from Google to Facebook, these monopolies. It's not only that they have massive reach, but the level of information they have about each and every one of you is just massive. And that has to be discussed and debated, even if they'll shut it down on those platforms.
Well, that's right. So the thing about fake news, right, is that, like, to me, fake news is a classic example of a negative externality. It's essentially the pollution that the factory puts in the water, right? Which is that, like, Facebook makes money off of this business model where that people are gaming. Like, Facebook makes money off it, right? Like, so if you set up a site and you say, here's, Denzel Washington endorsed Donald Trump, which is like my favorite fake news story of the last cycle, because, like, I don't know, maybe he did. It's not crazy, right? It's not like there's a child sex ring in a pizza parlor on Connecticut Avenue. It's like, I don't know, maybe Denzel endorsed Donald Trump. I don't know his politics. But that, the people that are setting up these sort of content mills and all this stuff and the entire ecosystem that's developed from it, the perspective of these sort of monopoly platforms with Facebook and YouTube is that like we don't have any responsibility for that. At some level, that's good, right? Like, do we want Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg to start reaching into the bowels of editorial control and being like, no, we're not showing Democracy Now!'s footage from Dakota Access Pipeline because we got a injunction letter, right? Exactly, it's too violent. Like, we certainly don't want that, right? But like, there's other stuff that maybe we don't want them posting. So there's this real question, like, that the entire ecosystem that's been built up right now that is giving people this unprecedented individual reach, the Philando Castile video, is based on massive monopoly power that is entirely unaccountable. Facebook could do whatever they want. Tomorrow, Facebook could open up the largest news room in the world. Tomorrow, they could start Facebook News, and 200 million people in the country would be watching Facebook video because they control what's in your newsfeed. They could do that tomorrow.
The trust issues, they don't seem to touch Facebook as much. I mean, there's tremendous distrust and lack of confidence in the media, in the courts, in the scientific community, in government. But everybody still feels pretty warm and fuzzy toward Facebook because you can see your friends' baby pictures, which, you know, you can understand to a point, but that power goes a little bit unchecked and
I think that's, to
unquestioned.
me, this is sort of the next frontier,
right.
Particularly with YouTube and Facebook, because they've become, their audiences are massive and they have unbelievable monopoly power. And like, at some point that's gonna.
Right. Okay, this is a nice positive question. Well, sort of. The majority of current political ads in France are positive. I want to do this. I will help do that. Sounds nice. Can we in the US get to that type of political dialogue, not the mudslinging, and if so, how? You have 2 minutes.
I don't know. I mean, I think negativity is underrated. I mean, great. Marine Le Pen is running positive ads. I think negativity is fine. I really do. Like, I think like politics is high stakes. It's conflict. It's necessarily conflict. People fight. I've actually been feeling this way and saying this on my show after this just unspeakably horrifying shooting that happened this week, which is just almost incomprehensible in its monstrousness, and also what those 2 Capitol Police officers saved us all from. Because imagine 12 body bags being carted off that field of Republican members of the United States Congress, and then imagine how era-defining that would have been. So they saved everyone from that. They saved the individual lives there and the entire society from something cataclysmic.
And also, let's not forget that 3 people were actually killed at the UPS facility in San Francisco within a few hours of what happened there, that horrific shooting in Alexandria. And we have to, I mean, I watched the networks. There was except if you watch The Zipper, you know almost nothing about what happened in San Francisco, and those people died. And it shows what people value. I mean, both are horrific. In this case, people died. Why don't we know more about this? And then you extend that to war. We know all about Manchester. I wrote a column last week that said we should use Manchester as the model for media coverage. All these kids who were killed, who were injured, we know their names, their family members, their parents, we heard their mothers. We need to use that same model. When what happened in Afghanistan last week, 150 people were killed in a terrorist explosion in the middle of Kabul. We need to know their names. And then people will be making very different decisions, whether it's Manchester, whether it's Yemen from a US drone strike. We have to personalize things. I actually grew up on soap operas, and it's not that, you know, so many people identified with women in evening gowns in the middle of the day drinking, but at least it wasn't people at that time, at least killing each other. You were following family dramas. And if you use that same model to follow the dramas of people in their communities, very real life stories, people get addicted. People are intensely interested.
We have just 3 more minutes. I think.
Just to finish the point, I think you don't have to tone down rhetoric. Basically, I think politics is a fight, and it's fine to fight. That's my general feeling. I mean, you shouldn't incite violence, obviously, and you shouldn't dehumanize other human beings.
And you just have to open up that debate to show the true diversity of views and options there.
So let me close with one last question, which I think might enable us to also think about a little takeaway. In the current climate, what do you envision the role of research and its findings can be in civic media dialogues and in fostering civic participation? Real news as opposed to fake news.
Yeah, I mean, I think good data is always good. So I like data. I'm a very data-driven person. There's a lot of terrible data in the industry I work in, which is a real problem. Garbage in, garbage out. So I actually think that, like, to be honest, actually, I think what Amy's saying is really key, right? So the idea of actually having good measures for what people are actually interested in, as opposed to what we think they're interested in, like, is really useful. That's a really useful metric. It's a useful metric for me, right? And for everyone. I think it would be a useful metric for newsrooms, right? Like, to find ways to measure, like, oh wow, there's actually a huge amount of engagement on the climate summit. There's a huge amount of engagement. And again, you get back to the problem that the places that could aggregate that are the monopoly enterprises like Facebook, which can tell you. But I do think that understanding that would be really helpful.
It's also not just about the facts, it's about who's telling the stories. People are engaged by other people telling their own stories. And I just want to say, though, I think in this period, in this era of Trump, where he, viciously attacks the media, I have been really shocked by this. I even hesitate to say it out loud. If he stopped for like a week attacking the media, the establishment media reflexively protects the establishment. And I think they would have wrapped themselves around him as well, except that they have to defensively defend themselves because he is so directly attacking them. And it's mattered. You see the media standing up saying, the media is essential to the functioning of a democratic society. But when it comes to war, because even in this period, when it comes to the U.S. Engaging in military action, still the media circles the wagons around the White House. When was it that they said Donald Trump became president? When he bombed the air base in Syria, when he dropped the largest non-nuclear bomb in the world ever on Afghanistan. I mean, the Moab, the mother of all bombs, right? It was developed under Bush. He didn't dare do it. President Obama didn't do it. But Trump, within a few weeks, he drops this bomb. So it's here that the media falls short. And we need the media to be ever more independent when it comes to war. I think what we need the media to do right now is to provide static, the dictionary definition of static. Criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is the fourth estate, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history.
I sort of feel like you are a one-woman riot.
Well said.
Thank you.
I think that was a heartfelt thanks for all of you for an outstanding panel. And I want to thank everybody who has spoken today, from our first panel, our Phil talkers, through this last panel. It has been an incredibly thought-provoking conversation. And I also think it's been a call to action. And we all know that we have work to do. And Philanthropy New York, as your organization, stands ready to help us as we go forward into this next year, taking the conversations, the suggestions, and the big issues that have been touched upon today. We stand ready to continue the conversation on all fronts, both through programming and supporting the work that you do. So one more round of thanks for the panel. And just before we all head out to lunch, I would love to have a round of thanks for the Philanthropy New York staff who put on today's program. Michael. And they're all wearing that little blue badge, so feel free to say thank you and chat with folks. And now let's go to lunch. And thank you, JP Morgan Chase. It is on the 12th floor, and there are staff who will guide you to the right elevators and get you upstairs. And we look forward to continuing the conversation there. Thank you.